The train had already pulled away by the time Evelyn Hart found the letter nailed to the station post, not slipped under a door, not handed to her with an apology or even the decency of eye contact. Nailed. Like a notice of foreclosure. Like something you'd post to warn people away from a condemned building. She stood on the platform in Cottonwood, Wyoming, her valise at her feet, her breath making small clouds in the February air, and read the 6 sentences that dismantled everything she had traveled 1,100 miles to reach. The man she was supposed to marry had changed his mind. He didn't say why. He didn't say he was sorry. He said only that he had reconsidered the arrangement, that he wished her well, and that he hoped she had a safe journey home. He had signed it respectfully, as if that word could do any work at all. The last eastbound train had left 20 minutes ago. The next one didn't come for 3 days. Evelyn read the letter twice. Then she folded it with great care, tucked it into her coat pocket, and sat down on the bench at the edge of the platform. She didn't cry. She had done her crying on the train through Ohio, when doubt had first found its way into her chest and settled there like a stone. Now there was nothing left but the cold, and the silence of a town that didn't know her name, and the slow realization that she had no idea what she was going to do next. If you've ever been left standing somewhere you didn't belong, with nothing but your own 2 feet between you and a complete collapse, stay with Evelyn. Because this is where her story really begins. And I promise you it is not the story you think it is. Before we go further, if you're watching this for the first time, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and click the like button. Every story I tell travels farther because of you. And drop a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Now let's go back to Cottonwood, Wyoming, 1887. Back to a woman sitting on a train platform in the cold, reading a letter she never should have had to read. Evelyn Hart was not the kind of woman people worried about. She was composed. She was organized. She had a talent for making difficult things look manageable, which was both her greatest asset and the reason most people never noticed when she was struggling. She came from a respectable family in Philadelphia, not wealthy, not poor, but carefully positioned in that narrow space between the two, where appearances required constant maintenance, and there was never quite enough room to breathe. Her father had been a school teacher. Her mother had been the sort of woman who ironed everything twice and never once raised her voice, which had always struck Evelyn as either admirable or suffocating, depending on the day. She was the eldest of 3 daughters. She had helped raise the younger 2. She had kept the household accounts after her father's eyesight began to fail, and she had done it without complaint, because complaining was not something women in her family did. They endured, they managed, they found a way. She had taught school for 4 years in a small building on Archer Street, 23 students between the ages of 6 and 14, and she had been good at it. Not just competent, genuinely good. She had a patience with struggling children that she couldn't fully explain, and a gift for making arithmetic seem less like punishment and more like a kind of puzzle worth solving. 2 of her former students had gone on to secondary school because of the extra hours she'd spent with them after class, though nobody had ever remarked on that directly. What people had remarked on, with increasing frequency over the past several years, was the fact that Evelyn Hart, 22 years old, was still unmarried. She understood the math of it. She was plain not ugly, but not the kind of woman men crossed a room to speak to. She was tall for a woman, which some men found unsettling. She had opinions, which she was usually wise enough to keep to herself, but not always. She had a habit of reading when she should have been socializing, and she had turned down 2 proposals already, both from decent enough men she simply couldn't imagine spending the next 40 years with, which had earned her a reputation in certain circles as being difficult. Her mother had sat her down in the parlor last winter, with the careful gentleness of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. "You're not getting younger, Evelyn." "I know, Mother." The Hargrove boy is still interested. The Hargrove boy is 43 and still calls women the fairer sex without irony. Her mother had pressed her lips together in that particular way she had. "You have standards no man can meet. I have standards I can meet myself." That had ended the conversation. But it hadn't ended the pressure, which had continued to build through the autumn and into January, until Evelyn had found herself sitting in the small office of the Westward Connections Agency on Market Street, filling out the forms that would send her photograph and a carefully composed letter to a cattle rancher in Wyoming named Douglas Fitch. She had not been romantic about it. She was not a girl who dreamed of love on the frontier. She wanted a different life, not necessarily a perfect one, just one where she wasn't slowly disappearing into the furniture of someone else's expectations. Wyoming had seemed as good a direction as any. Douglas Fitch's responding letter had been brief and oddly formal, which she'd taken as shyness rather than coldness. He was 34, owned a small cattle operation outside of Cottonwood, and had written that he was looking for a practical woman who could manage a household and wasn't afraid of hard work. He had not asked anything about her interests or her opinions, which had given her a moment's pause. But she'd told herself that letters were a limited medium, and that people expanded in person. She had given notice at the school. She had told her family. She had packed her life into a single valise and a small trunk, sent the trunk ahead by freight, and gotten on a train with $78. A return ticket she'd promised herself she wouldn't use, and the letter from Douglas Fitch folded inside her coat pocket like a passport to somewhere better. 1,100 miles, 3 train changes. One night in a station hotel in Chicago where the room smelled of mildew and she'd slept badly but woken determined. She had come so far. She had committed to this. She was going to make it work. And then she'd found the other letter, the one nailed to the post. The station agent's name was Greer. He was a compact man with a red face and the particular wariness of someone who had seen too many mail-order brides arrive to too many empty platforms. And he watched Evelyn from behind his window with the practiced neutrality of a man who had learned not to get involved. Evelyn walked to his window with her valise and her folded letter and set both down on the counter with the deliberate calm of someone holding themselves together through sheer force of habit. "I'm Evelyn Hart," she said. "I was expected today by a Mr. Douglas Fitch. I found this on the platform." Greer looked at the letter without touching it. "Yes, ma'am. Did he leave this himself?" "Sent his hired man." She absorbed that. A hired man. He couldn't even be troubled to come personally. "And you allowed this to be posted to the station board rather than what? Handing it to the man and asking him to deliver it properly?" Greer shifted his weight. "Not really my business, ma'am." "What?" "It became your business," Evelyn said, with a quietness that was somehow worse than raising her voice. "The moment you allowed a woman traveling alone to walk off a train and find out her entire future had been canceled on a piece of paper tacked to a board like a lost dog notice." Greer said nothing. There was really nothing to say. "When is the next train east?" 3 days. "And west?" "Tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock." She looked at him for a moment. "Is there a hotel in this town?" "Boarding house, Mrs. Nora Delaney, 2 blocks east on Main Street." He paused. "It's decent." "Cheat you." Evelyn nodded once, picked up her valise, and walked out of the station. The cold hit her again the moment she stepped outside. That particular Wyoming cold that came with wind and got into everything. She stood on the steps for a moment and looked at the town spread out before her, a main street with false-fronted buildings, a livery stable at one end, a general store, a saloon she had no intention of entering, a few scattered houses set back from the road. Small, sparse. Nothing like what she'd imagined, though she wasn't sure what she'd imagined exactly. She had $68 left after her travel expenses. A return ticket to Philadelphia that she would have to cash in and use for a different line, and absolutely nowhere to go for the next 3 days. She picked up her valise and started walking. The boarding house was a 2-story building that had been painted yellow at some point and faded to something closer to cream. A sign above the door read Delaney House Clean Rooms Reasonable Rates. A calico cat was asleep on the porch railing with the complete indifference of a creature that had no problems worth mentioning. Evelyn knocked. The woman who answered the door was perhaps 40, with dark hair shot through with gray, and the kind of face that had been pretty once, and was now something better, expressive, worn in, interesting. She looked at Evelyn and then at the valise, and something shifted in her expression that wasn't quite recognition but was adjacent to it. "You'd be the young woman from Philadelphia," she said. "News travels fast. Greer's wife is my neighbor." The woman stepped back from the door. "Come in out of that cold. I'm Nora Delaney." The front room was warm and smelled of coffee and something baking, and Evelyn stood just inside the door and felt, for the first time since the train platform, like she might not fall apart entirely. "I should tell you," she began. "You don't have to tell me anything yet," Nora said, already moving toward the kitchen. "Sit down first. You look like you've been standing in the cold deciding whether to cry or not, and both options are perfectly acceptable, but they're better done somewhere warm. Coffee?" Evelyn sat. "Please." Nora poured 2 cups without the kind of commentary that Philadelphia women would have offered, the careful probing sympathy that was really just curiosity wearing a polite face. She set 1 cup in front of Evelyn and sat down across from her with her own and waited. Evelyn found herself telling her anyway. Not all of it, not the Philadelphia part, not her mother and the parlor in the Westward Connections office on Market Street. Just the part that mattered, the platform, the letter, the hired man who hadn't had the decency to deliver it by hand. Norris listened without interrupting. When Evelyn finished, she was quiet for a moment and said, "That's a cowardly thing for a man to do." "Yes," Evelyn agreed. "It is. Did you love him?" "I'd never met him." "No, but sometimes women—" Nora stopped. "Never mind. That's not my business. I wasn't in love with him," Evelyn said. I was in love with the idea of a different life, which is probably worse, because that's harder to grieve. Nora looked at her steadily. Or easier, because you haven't lost a person. You've lost a plan, and plans can be remade. Evelyn wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Outside, the wind had picked up and was pressing against the windows with quiet persistence. I don't know where I'd begin. You'd begin with a warm room and a decent meal, Nora said, which I can provide for $1 a night. And tomorrow you'd begin again from there. Evelyn was shown to a small room on the second floor with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the back lot where someone had left a set of fence rails stacked for repair. She unpacked her valise slowly and methodically, which was something she did when she needed to feel like she had some control over something. She hung her second dress on the hook behind the door. She set her small bottle of ink and her journal on the washstand. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the floor and thought, with the clear-eyed severity she generally reserved for problems she needed to actually solve rather than feel her way through, about what her options were. She had $68. She had a return ticket that could be converted. She had a teaching certificate. She had no husband and no prospects and no one in Wyoming who owed her anything. The return ticket would take her back to a city where her failure was already the subject of polite speculation, where her mother would receive her with that specific brand of compassion that contained within it the faint satisfaction of having been right, where she would have to go back to the school on Archer Street if they'd take her back and resume the life she'd been trying to leave, and pretend that Wyoming had been a misadventure rather than a catastrophe. She could do that. She'd survived worse humiliations. She was good at making the best of things. But she sat on the edge of that narrow bed in the fading light and felt something harden in her chest that wasn't grief and wasn't anger. Exactly, it was closer to refusal. A quiet, stubborn refusal to let Douglas Fitch's cowardice write the final sentence of this chapter. She had come 1,100 miles. She had given up a job and disappointed her family and spent $60 on train fare. She had done all of that for a chance at something different, and she had not gotten the thing she came for. But she was still here. She was still standing. Whatever came next was still possible. She picked up her journal and opened it to a blank page and wrote, in her careful schoolteacher's hand, "What are the facts?" She wrote them out. All of them. Not the feelings, she'd get to those later, just the facts. Then she wrote, "What do I know how to do?" She wrote that list too. Then she sat for a long time looking at both lists. When she came downstairs for dinner, she had made up her mind about exactly nothing. But she had stopped feeling like a woman whose life had ended on a train platform and started feeling, cautiously and with considerable uncertainty, like a woman who might still have some decisions to make. Nora Delaney set a table that bore no relationship to apology. There was roast chicken with gravy, fried potatoes, cornbread, and a dish of preserved peaches that tasted like summer translated into something you could hold on to through the winter. 2 other boarders were at the table, an older man named Crawford, who sold feed and didn't say much, and a young woman named Polly who worked at the general store and was frankly curious about Evelyn in the way of someone who didn't have much else to be curious about. Polly lasted about 4 minutes before she asked directly, "Are you the one who got left?" "Polly," Nora said. "I'm just asking what everyone's going to ask anyway." Evelyn reached for the cornbread. "Yes," she said pleasantly, "though I prefer to think of it as being released from an obligation I hadn't yet fully entered into." Polly blinked. "That's one way to put it. It's the accurate way." Crawford looked up from his plate. "Fitch is a fool," he said, which was apparently all the commentary he had on the subject, and returned to his chicken. Nora passed the potatoes to Evelyn with the serene efficiency of a woman who had managed difficult dinner-table conversations for years. Evelyn taught school in Philadelphia, she offered, with the particular deliberateness of someone changing a subject while making it look like a natural turn. "Did you?" Polly leaned forward. "For how long?" 4 years. "Elk Creek's been looking for a teacher for 6 months, Polly said immediately, and then looked at Nora as if checking whether this was appropriate to say. Nora considered it. "They have been," she confirmed more carefully. "It's a small settlement, about 20 miles northwest. The last teacher they had left in September went back east for family reasons. They've had parents taking turns with the children since then, which isn't working." Evelyn looked at her. "How many children?" 26, 28. "Frontier families. Ages vary considerably." "Is there a school building?" "Small one. 1 room. There's quarters attached for the teacher." Evelyn set down her fork. "Who would I speak to about it?" Polly made a sound that was almost a laugh. "You just got here." "I know," Evelyn said. "But I'm not sure staying in Cottonwood for 3 days, waiting for a train east, is the best use of my time. And I'd like to know what I'm working with before I make any decisions." There was a brief silence at the table. Crawford looked at her with something that might have been approval. "The settlement leader is a man named Abner Pruitt," Nora said slowly. He comes into town most Fridays for supplies. But you could also speak to the county administrator, Mr. Holt. His office is on Main Street tomorrow, Evelyn said. I'll speak to him tomorrow. Nora looked at her for a moment. Then something in her expression settled, not surprise, exactly, but a kind of recognition. The look of a woman who had seen a lot of people arrive in this town and had learned to tell the ones who were passing through from the ones who might, against all expectations, stay. All right, she said. I'll walk you to Holt's office myself. The morning came gray and cold and very early, and Evelyn was dressed and downstairs before the sun had fully cleared the ridge to the east. Nora was already in the kitchen with coffee made and biscuits in the oven, and she looked at Evelyn's face and didn't say anything about the shadows under her eyes or the careful way she was holding herself. They were finishing their coffee when the front door opened and a man came in without knocking, which suggested he was someone who had reason to believe he was welcome. He was taller than most men Evelyn had encountered, though she'd have been hard-pressed to say why that was the first thing she noticed. He had the kind of face that had been outdoors in every kind of weather, and hadn't suffered for it, with dark hair and a jaw that was carrying 2 days of growth, and didn't seem to be in any hurry about it. He was wearing a coat that had seen considerable use and carrying his hat in one hand, and he stopped when he saw Evelyn with the surprise of someone who had come looking for his sister and found instead a stranger in the kitchen. Caleb, Nora said. This is Evelyn Hart from Philadelphia. Evelyn, this is my brother, Caleb Mercer, ma'am, he said, with a nod that was more natural than formal. Mr. Mercer. Nora poured him coffee without being asked. He sat at the other end of the table and wrapped both hands around the cup. And Evelyn had the distinct impression that he was the kind of man who warmed up slowly to most things not unfriendly, but careful. You're the woman from the station, he said, not unkindly. Just stating it. I am, Crawford told me, he said, and then seemed to feel that needed clarifying. I was at the feed store early this morning. He mentioned it. News does travel fast in small towns. It does. He took a drink of his coffee. What are you planning to do? It was a direct question. The kind men asked other men, but rarely thought to ask women, and Evelyn looked at him with more attention than she'd been giving him before. I'm going to speak to the county administrator this morning about the teaching position in Elk Creek. He was quiet for a moment. That's 20 miles out. I'm aware. It's a frontier settlement. The families are good people, but the conditions. He stopped. I run horses through that area fairly regularly. The schoolhouse needs work. Most things need work, Evelyn said. That doesn't make them not worth doing. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, not exactly, but adjacent to one. He looked at his sister, who was studying the inside of her coffee cup with great interest. I'll ride along to Holt's office, he said, setting his cup down. I know him. Might speed things along. Evelyn had not asked for his help. She had not given any indication that she needed it. She looked at him steadily for a moment, trying to determine whether this was the kind of offer that came with strings, the kind that turned into an assumption of debt, or whether it was something simpler than that. His face gave her nothing to work with except straightforwardness, which was its own kind of answer. All right, she said, thank you. Holt's office was on the second floor of a building that also housed the land registry and a printing operation that smelled powerfully of ink. He was a thin man in his 50s with a precise manner and a file for everything, and he looked at Evelyn over his spectacles when Caleb introduced her with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to reserve judgment until the evidence was in. Miss Hart, he said, you have a teaching certificate? From the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, valid for the past 4 years. I have it here. She placed it on his desk. He looked at it. You've been teaching continuously? Yes. At Archer Street Primary in Philadelphia. 28 students. Different ages. That's not a city classroom. I understand that. Have you taught in a one-room setting before? I've taught in a room that was technically 2 rooms with a wall removed, she said. Does that count? He looked at her for a moment. Then he almost smiled. What happened to your marriage arrangement? It was an abrupt pivot, and she took it without flinching. The man reconsidered. And you're considering this position rather than going home?
Yes.
Why? She had thought about this answer on the walkover, and she gave him the honest version rather than the strategic one. Because I came 1,100 miles for a different life, and it seems wasteful to turn around and go home just because the specific shape of that life didn't work out. There are children in Elk Creek who don't have a teacher, and I'm a teacher without a classroom. That seems like a problem worth solving. Holt was quiet for a moment. He glanced at Caleb, who was leaning against the wall near the door with his arms folded and no particular expression, and then back at Evelyn. The position pays $22 a month, he said. There's a living space attached to the school, small but adequate. The county provides fuel. Families provide what they can for supplies, which in practice means you'll want to be adaptable. I can be adaptable. I'll need to write to the Elk Creek families. There are a few who would want to meet you before committing, which is reasonable, completely reasonable. You understand this is a conditional arrangement until that meeting takes place. I understand. He looked at her for another long moment, the kind of look that was taking measure in a quiet, methodical way. Then he said, Mrs. Pruitt has been managing the children 3 days a week. I'll send word that someone is coming. Evelyn nodded. When? Can you be ready Friday? It was Tuesday. Yes, she said. He picked up her certificate and made a note in his file. All right, Miss Hart. I'll be in touch by Thursday at the latest. She shook his hand, which seemed to surprise him slightly, and walked out. Caleb followed. On the stairs he said, You didn't hesitate. I'd done my thinking before I walked in. Most people take longer. I had a very long night. She pushed the door at the bottom and stepped out into the cold air of the street. It's amazing what you can clarify when you have nothing else to do. He looked at her. There was that almost smile again. Can I ask you something? You can ask. Are you frightened? She stopped walking. Not because the question surprised her, because it was an honest question, and it deserved an honest answer, and she wanted to get it right. Yes, she said, considerably. But I've been frightened before and it didn't stop me, so I don't see why it should now. He was quiet for a moment. The street around them was waking up, a wagon rolling past, someone calling to someone else across the way. The sounds of an ordinary morning in a town that didn't know her and owed her nothing. Elk Creek's a good community, he said. The families work hard. They'll give you a fair shot if you give them one. I intend to, he nodded, then you'll be all right. It wasn't a reassurance. It wasn't a promise. It was an assessment offered plainly. The way you might tell someone that a particular stretch of road was passable if you were careful. Evelyn found somewhat to her own surprise that she appreciated it more than anything comforting would have been. Thank you for coming with me this morning, she said. Holt's easier when he knows someone. He settled his hat back on his head. I'll be around if you need anything before Friday. He walked back toward the livery, and Evelyn stood on the street in the cold for a moment, watching him go and thinking that Douglas Fitch had done her a considerable disservice, and perhaps, in a way she couldn't quite articulate yet, an unexpected favor. She had come to Wyoming to begin a new life. She hadn't expected the beginning to look quite like this. But she was beginning to think that might not be entirely a bad thing. She turned back toward the boarding house, her chin up, her valise no longer feeling quite so heavy, and walked through a town that was still a stranger to her, but not, she suspected, for very much longer. The Thursday letter from Holt arrived before breakfast. Nora brought it upstairs herself rather than leaving it on the hall table, which told Evelyn something about how the household had already quietly reorganized itself around her situation. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, pulling on her second boot when the knock came, and she read the letter standing up, still holding the boot she hadn't put on yet. Holt's handwriting was the careful, slightly compressed script of a man who had learned to say a great deal in a small space. The Elk Creek families had been notified, Mrs. Abner Pruitt had sent word back that the community would meet with Miss Hart on Saturday at the schoolhouse, 1 day later than originally planned, because 2 of the family heads had cattle to move on Friday and couldn't make the ride. The position was still available. The conditional arrangement stood. He expected her to confirm by end of day. She set the letter on the washstand and finished putting on her boot. Downstairs, Nora was at the stove, and Caleb was already at the table with coffee and what appeared to be a map he'd unfolded partway and then lost interest in. He'd been in and out of the boarding house every day since Tuesday for reasons that were, as far as Evelyn could tell, entirely legitimate. He had a horse he was boarding at the livery while he dealt with some business in town. He was helping Nora fix a section of porch railing that had been soft for months. He had stopped by Wednesday evening to drop off a copy of a county survey he thought might be useful if Evelyn wanted to understand the geography between Cottonwood and Elk Creek, which was either very practical or very transparent, and she hadn't decided which. "Letter from Holt?" he asked, without looking up from the map. "How did you know?" Nora was watching the road from 6 this morning. Nora from the stove, I was not. She was, he said. She does it when she's worried about something and doesn't want to say so. Nora turned from the stove with a spatula and pointed it at him in a way that was not quite threatening. "I do not. You absolutely do. You did it when I was 17 and riding in bad weather. And you did it last February when Crawford was 2 days late with his rent." Evelyn sat down at the table with her letter. "The meeting is Saturday, at the schoolhouse in Elk Creek." The argument between the siblings stopped with the clean efficiency of people who had been having it, in various forms, for decades, and could pause it anywhere without losing their place. "Saturday," Nora said. "Good, that gives us tomorrow to get you ready." "I'm already ready. You need warmer boots." Evelyn looked down at her boots. They were perfectly adequate boots for Philadelphia. She had discovered over 3 days in Wyoming, entirely inadequate for Wyoming. "I'll go to the general store," she said. "I'll come with you," Nora said, which was less an offer than a statement of fact. Caleb folded his map. "I'll drive you out Saturday," he said. I know the road and the weather's been uncertain. It's not a good ride alone if you don't know the terrain. Evelyn looked at him. There was the question again, the one she kept having to answer for herself, about whether his help came with an accounting she'd be expected to settle later. She'd been watching him for 3 days now, in the way she'd learned to watch people, when she was trying to understand them rather than just respond to them. And what she'd seen was a man who did things because they seemed like the right thing to do, and then moved on without requiring acknowledgement. He'd fixed Nora's porch railing in an hour, and then eaten dinner and talked about a horse sale in Laramie, without once mentioning the railing again. She thought about the road. 20 miles of it in February in country she didn't know. "All right," she said, "thank you." He nodded and reached for his coffee. "You should eat something before you write to Holt. You think better on a full stomach." "I think perfectly well on any stomach." "Maybe," he said. "But you look like you haven't been sleeping enough, and food helps with that too." It was a frank, slightly presumptuous observation. Evelyn decided on reflection that she didn't mind it. Nora put a plate of biscuits on the table and sat down across from Evelyn with her own coffee, and the morning settled into something that was, despite everything, almost comfortable. There was something odd about that, the odd comfort of a boarding house kitchen in a strange town, with a woman she'd known 4 days and a man she'd known 3, feeling more at ease than she had in most of the drawing rooms she'd spent her life being careful in. She wrote to Holt after breakfast. She confirmed Saturday. Then she went with Nora to the general store and bought boots that actually meant business. Friday passed in the particular suspended way that days before, something important, always do slow in the middle, and then abruptly gone. Evelyn spent part of it writing in her journal, and part of it helping Nora with mending, which was not something she'd offered to do but had found herself doing because sitting still and waiting had never agreed with her temperament. Polly came by in the afternoon with the news that Douglas Fitch had been seen in town that morning buying lumber, which caused a brief, charged silence in the sitting room that nobody addressed directly. "I thought you should know," Polly said, with the particular combination of sympathy and interest that characterized most of her contributions to conversation. "Thank you," Evelyn said, and kept her needle moving. She thought about it anyway. She couldn't help that. She'd gotten fairly good over the years at separating what she felt from what she did with what she felt, and what she felt right now was a low, cold anger that was not dramatic enough to be satisfying and not distant enough to be comfortable. She hadn't been in love with Douglas Fitch. She'd said that honestly to Nora on the first night, and she still meant it. But she had trusted the arrangement, and the arrangement had been broken without the courtesy of a conversation. And the anger she felt was the anger of someone who had been treated as a problem to be avoided, rather than a person to be spoken to. She would not go looking for him. She would not make a scene. She was not by nature a scene-making woman. But she noticed that she was glad to be leaving for Elk Creek in the morning, and that the gladness felt clean. Caleb had the wagon at the boarding house at 6:30, which was earlier than necessary, and which Evelyn suspected was less about the road conditions, and more about giving them enough time to stop if something needed stopping. He'd put a heavy canvas over the wagon bed, and there were 2 blankets on the seat that Nora had sent out with him, along with a wrapped package of biscuits and cold chicken that Evelyn found on the seat when she climbed up. "Your sister packed this," she said. "She packs for everyone. It's how she shows she's worried without saying she's worried." She mentioned something about that tendency. He clicked to the horses, and the wagon moved out of town with the steady, unhurried rhythm of an animal that knew its work. The morning was cold and clear in the particular bright way that February mornings in Wyoming could be, the light sharp and thin, the shadows long and blue, the whole landscape open in a way that still stopped Evelyn somewhere in her chest when she wasn't expecting it. She had grown up in a city. She had spent her life between buildings. She'd known, intellectually, that the West was different. But there was an enormous gap between knowing something intellectually and sitting in a wagon on a February morning, watching the light come sideways across country so big and open that it made her feel, in alternation, terrified and electrified. "You're quiet," Caleb said. "I'm looking." He glanced at the horizon with the comfortable disinterest of someone who had looked at it 10,000 times. "It gets you like that the first time. Does it stop? The getting you part?" "No. You just get used to being gotten." She turned that over for a moment. "That's either reassuring or ominous. I can't decide which." He didn't quite smile, but his shoulders moved in a way that suggested he might have, if he'd been the smiling kind. Little of both, probably. They rode in silence for a while, which was a different kind of silence than the ones Evelyn was used to, not the polite, managed silence of people who had run out of things to say, but the silence of 2 people who were both occupied with their own thoughts and didn't feel the need to fill the space. She found to her mild surprise that she didn't feel the need to fill it either. She was not, in general, a woman who talked for the sake of talking. She'd spent enough of her life in rooms where the conversation was purely performative to have developed a genuine appreciation for its absence. After about 40 minutes, he said, "What's your plan if they don't take you?" "I've been thinking about that. And there's a mining settlement about 30 miles further north that Crawford mentioned at dinner Wednesday. He said they'd had 3 men injured last fall, and their camp cook left in November. I have no particular culinary skills, but I can organize a supply operation, which is apparently what they actually need." Caleb looked at her sideways. "You'd go to a mining settlement alone?" "I'd prefer not to," she said honestly. "But I'd do it if it was the better option." He was quiet for a moment. "You've thought this through more than most people would." "I spent Thursday making contingency plans. It seemed like a better use of time than worrying. Most people worry anyway, even when they're making plans." "I did both," she admitted. "But at least one of them was productive." He looked at the road ahead. "Elk Creek will take you," he said. "Abner Pruitt's a practical man. His wife is sharper than he is. They need a teacher more than they need someone perfect, and you're more than adequate." "More than adequate," she repeated. "High praise." "I don't say things I don't mean," he said. She believed him. It was that thing about Caleb Mercer that she'd been trying to put her finger on. Since Tuesday morning in his sister's kitchen, he said exactly what he thought, and nothing extra. And it was so different from the careful social language she'd been navigating her entire life that she kept bracing for the subtext and finding there wasn't any. "Why do you run horses through Elk Creek?" she asked. "If it's a small settlement. Pruitt has good grazing land. We have a standing arrangement. I move horses through his pasture when I need to rest them between Cottonwood and Laramie. He gets grazing fees. I get a reliable stopover. Works for both of us, so you know the community well enough. I've shared meals with most of the families. Helped with a barn raising 3 years ago." He paused. "It's a decent place. Hard but decent." She looked out at the road, which was getting narrower. As they moved further from Cottonwood, the wheel ruts more pronounced, the occasional tree line coming closer on the northern side. "Did you always want to run horses?" It was a personal question, and she knew it, and she was half expecting him to deflect, but he answered as simply as he answered everything else. "My father ran cattle. I watched him work himself into the ground for something that never quite came right. Horses are different. They move, they travel. You're not tied to one piece of land waiting for rain." He was quiet for a moment. "I like things I can move through." There was something in that answer that felt honest in a way that went past the surface of it. Evelyn didn't push. The wagon went around a bend in the road, and the valley opened up below them, and she saw Elk Creek for the first time, a scattering of buildings along a creek bottom, smoke rising from chimneys, a church steeple at the far end, and on the near side a small square building with a porch that was probably the schoolhouse. It was smaller than she'd expected. Almost everything in Wyoming was smaller than she'd expected and also larger, and she was beginning to understand that those things were not contradictions. "There it is," Caleb said. Evelyn sat up straighter without quite meaning to. Abner Pruitt was exactly as Crawford had described him over a subsequent dinner, a large, deliberate man who chose his words carefully and meant every one of them. He was somewhere in his 50s, with a weathered face, and the slightly formal manners of someone who had grown up, knowing that first impressions were one of the few things you had complete control over. He met them in front of the schoolhouse, with his hat in his hand, which Evelyn interpreted as respectful rather than deferential. His wife, Margaret Pruitt, was a different proposition entirely. She was small and fast, and she looked at Evelyn with the focused intensity of someone who had been doing the job that needed doing, and wanted to know immediately whether the person in front of her was actually going to relieve her of it or just make more work. She shook Evelyn's hand the way men shook hands, firmly and without elaboration. "You've taught before," she said, which was technically a question, but sounded more like an accusation she was willing to drop if the answer was right. 4 years, Philadelphia. I have my certificate and 3 letters of reference." "Can you handle a room with children of different ages all at the same time?" "Yes." "Can you handle a room with children of different ages when 2 of them hate each other, and one of them hasn't eaten since yesterday, and one of them can't see past 10 feet, but her parents won't admit it?" Evelyn looked at her steadily. "I've had 23 children at once with variations on all of those problems. The one who can't see needs to sit in the front. The ones who hate each other need to be separated until you understand why, and then either addressed or accommodated. The one who hasn't eaten needs something from the desk drawer you keep stocked for exactly that reason." Margaret Pruitt looked at her for a long moment. "Come inside," she said. The schoolhouse was cold and smelled of wood and dust and the faint ghost of chalk. It had 12 bench desks, a blackboard that needed refinishing, a stove that Abner lit before they'd been inside 2 minutes, and a small door at the back that led to the teacher's quarters, one room with a narrow bed, a washstand, a small stove of its own, and a window that faced east. Evelyn stood in the middle of the schoolroom and looked at the blackboard and the desks and the low ceiling and the stove that was already beginning to throw heat, and something settled in her that had been unsettled for the better part of a week. She could work in this room. She knew immediately and completely that she could work in this room. The desks need adjusting, she said. 2 of them are the wrong height for younger children. And the blackboard needs— We know about the blackboard, Margaret said. We've been waiting on a replacement piece from Laramie. It's coming. What books do you have? Boxes there. Abner pointed to the corner. Donations from families. Some are from back east. A few people brought them when they came west. Others we ordered through the county. Evelyn went to the boxes. She crouched down and sorted through them with the focused efficiency of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for, pulling out readers, arithmetic texts, a geography primer, and what appeared to be 3 copies of the same novel about the American Revolution that were going to be less immediately useful, but might come in handy for the older students. What are the children's current levels? She asked, without looking up. Margaret sat on the edge of a desk, all over the place. The Bauer children there are 4 of them are sharp, especially the oldest, Hannah. She's 11, and she's already past what we can teach her. The youngest Dunboy is 7 and still can't read a full sentence, but I think it's something with how he sees letters, not how smart he is. And then there's Samuel Reyes, who's 13 and about as interested in school as a cat is in arithmetic, but his mother insists. Evelyn set down the books she was holding and looked up at Margaret. I'd like to meet them. The families are coming this afternoon. 2 o'clock. She stood up. Then we have time. Can you tell me about the families? Not just the children. The families. Margaret looked at Abner. Something passed between them. Then she said, Sit down, Miss Hart. This might take a while. Caleb had positioned himself on the porch with the particular unobtrusiveness of a man who had accompanied someone to something and understood that his role was to be available but not present. When Evelyn came back out an hour later, she found him whittling something that had not yet decided what it was, and he looked up without any urgency. Well, he said, Margaret Pruitt talked to me for an hour about 26 children and their families. I think I took 3 pages of notes. Good sign. She's very direct. Abner says she could run the county if anyone would let her. He folded his knife. How's the schoolroom? Workable. Cold. The blackboard needs replacing and 2 desks are wrong, but the stove works and the books are reasonable. She looked back at the building. The teachers' quarters are small but adequate. You sound like Holt. Holt had reasonable criteria. She wrapped her coat tighter against the wind. The families are coming this afternoon. I know. I'll stay. She looked at him. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He put his knife away. I want to see how it goes. She could have pushed back on that. She decided not to. There was something about the way he said it. Not, I want to make sure you're all right, which would have been condescending. And not, I have business here anyway, which would have been transparent. Just, I want to see how it goes. Like it mattered to him in a direct and uncomplicated way that he wasn't interested in dressing up. All right, she said. There's biscuits in the wagon. I know, I already had one, Caleb. There are plenty left. The families arrived in 1s and 2s over the course of a half hour, which gave Evelyn time to arrange herself in a way that felt neither stiff nor casual. She stood near the front of the room with the stove at her back and her hands clasped in front of her, and watched each family come in and find a place to stand or sit with the practiced assessment she'd learned 4 years of teaching had sharpened to something close to instinct. There were 7 families including the Pruitts, 14 adults, some of whom had children with them and some of whom had left them home. They were all different, a German family named Bauer, who had come from Indiana, a Mexican family named Reyes, who ran sheep on the eastern side of the valley, a widow named Clara Finch, with 2 boys who had the careful quietness of children who'd learned early not to take up more space than necessary. But they had in common the specific quality of frontier, people who had made hard choices and were used to measuring everything by whether it would last. Evelyn didn't make a speech. She'd considered it and discarded it. She introduced herself, stated her qualifications plainly, and then asked a question. What do you want for your children? It stopped the room. People weren't expecting to be asked. She waited. The first person to speak was Clara Finch, which surprised some of the others, judging by 1 or 2 expressions. She was young, couldn't have been more than 28, and she spoke quietly but without hesitation. I want them to be able to take care of themselves. I want them to be able to read a contract and understand it, and write a letter and mean it, and figure out whether someone's cheating them. Good, Evelyn said. That's exactly what school is for. Heinrich Bauer, the German farmer, spoke next, in English that was careful and precise. My Hannah, she is fast. She finishes before others. She gets bored. I'll give her more. She can help with the younger ones when she's ready if she wants to. Some children like that. Some don't. She likes it, he said immediately. Maria Reyes, Samuel's mother said. My son thinks he is too old for school. He's 13. He's old enough to understand why school matters. I'll make it worth his time, or I'll hear from him about why it isn't, and we'll adjust." She paused. "I won't pretend school is exciting when it isn't, but I'll make it useful." Maria Reyes looked at her for a moment, then nodded once. They went around the room. Each family had something different they needed, and Evelyn listened to every one of them and answered as directly as she could. Without promising things she wasn't sure she could deliver, and without hedging things she was. When it was over, there was a silence that felt more like consideration than reluctance. Abner Pruitt said, "I think we should step outside for a moment." Evelyn nodded. She walked to the back room and stood beside the small east-facing window and looked out at the empty field behind the schoolhouse while the families talked in the main room, and she thought, with the same clear-eyed practicality she'd been applying to everything since Tuesday, that she had done everything she could do. The rest was up to them. Caleb was leaning against the back wall of the schoolhouse when she came through the back door. He had his hat pulled down against the wind, and he straightened when he saw her. "They're deciding," she said. "How do you think it went?" "I don't know. I think Clara Finch is on my side. I think the Bowers are. Maria Reyes I couldn't read." "Maria Reyes doesn't show her hand to anyone," he said, "but she's practical, and her son needs structure more than she'll say out loud. I got that impression." He looked at her. "Are you nervous?" "I was nervous this morning. Now I just want an answer." She looked out at the field. "I meant what I said in there. I'm not going to make them promises I can't keep. I don't know yet exactly what these children need. I'll know after 2 weeks, and by 4 weeks I'll have a plan, and by end of term I'll have results. That's how it works. It's not dramatic." "No," he said. "It's not, but it's honest." "Yes," he said, "it is." The back door of the schoolhouse opened and Margaret Pruitt appeared in it. "Miss Hart," she said, "we'd like to speak with you." Evelyn straightened. She walked back to the door, and Caleb held it open without being asked. And she went through into the warmth of the schoolroom where 7 families were waiting, and she stood in the front of the room again, with her hands at her sides, and looked at Abner Pruitt, who cleared his throat once and said, "Miss Hart, we would like to offer you the position if you're still willing." She'd been ready for this. She'd rehearsed the answer. She was going to be measured and professional and thank them for their consideration. What she said was, "Yes, I'm willing." She said it more quickly than she'd intended, and something about the quickness of it made Clara Finch smile in the back of the room, and the smile was genuine enough that Evelyn felt it somewhere she didn't usually let things reach. "You can start Monday," Margaret said. "We'll help you move your things out Saturday after next." "I'd like to start getting the room ready before Monday," Evelyn said, "if that's acceptable." Margaret looked at her. "I thought you might," she said. The drive back to Cottonwood was quieter than the drive out, but it was the satisfied quiet of something accomplished rather than the suspended quiet of something anticipated. The light was falling at a low angle by the time they got back on the road, turning the open country gold and amber in a way that Evelyn was starting to understand was not unusual here, but was still worth looking at every time. They were about halfway back when Caleb said, without preamble, "My father tried to get my mother to marry him 3 times before she said yes." Evelyn looked at him. "Why are you telling me that?" She kept saying she needed to think about it. He thought she was refusing. She was just being sure. He kept his eyes on the road. "She told me once that the difference between a decision you make because you're desperate and a decision you make because you want it is everything." She said a person can tell the difference in themselves, even if they can't always say it. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. The horses moved steadily on the road. The light kept doing what it was doing. "I wanted it," she said. "The position, I know," he said. "That's why I told you." She didn't respond to that. She turned it over instead and looked at the road ahead, and thought that she had come to Wyoming with a plan that had failed completely and ended up somewhere she hadn't expected, doing something she hadn't planned, feeling something she wasn't sure yet how to name. The town came into view as the last light went. She could see the lamp in Nora's front window from half a mile out. "Nora will want to hear everything," she said. "She'll have questions ready. She's been thinking about them all day." "How do you know that?" "Because I know my sister." He guided the wagon around the last bend. "And because she already likes you, which means she's invested." Evelyn looked at the lamp in the window. It was a small, ordinary thing, a lit window in a boarding house in a small Wyoming town, and it had no business feeling like anything in particular. But she was 22 years old, and she was 8 days from Philadelphia and 4 days from a train platform, and she had spent the day convincing a community of frontier families that she was worth trusting, and the lit window in the cold evening felt, without her permission, a great deal like being expected home. She didn't say that. She wasn't sure she could have explained it, but she felt it, and she let herself feel it, and when Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the boarding house, she climbed down before he could help her, and went up the porch steps with the biscuit wrapper tucked under her arm, and pushed open the door to the warmth and the smell of dinner. and Nora Delaney already coming out of the kitchen with her hands still floury, and her face full of the question she'd been holding all day. "Well," Nora said. Evelyn unwound her scarf. "I start Monday," she said. Nora's hands went to her face, flour and all, and she made a sound that was not quite a word, something between relief and happiness. The kind of sound people make when something they were hoping for actually comes through, and they realized they'd been holding their breath for it. Caleb came in behind Evelyn, stamping the cold off his boots, and looked at his sister with the tolerant affection of a man who had long ago accepted that she was going to feel things at full volume, and there was nothing to be done about it. "She talked them into it in about 90 minutes, he said, "including Margaret Pruitt, which I didn't think would happen that fast." "I didn't talk anyone into anything," Evelyn said. "I just answered their questions." "That's what talking people into things looks like, when it's done well," Nora said, and went back to the kitchen, calling behind her, "Dinner in 20 minutes. Sit down, both of you. I want to hear everything." Evelyn sat. Caleb sat across from her and folded his hands on the table and looked at her with that steady, undemonstrative regard of his, the look she'd been trying to classify for days, and kept failing to fit into any of the categories she had available. "You should be pleased with yourself," he said. "I'm cautiously optimistic," she said. "That's as close as you get to pleased?" "That's as close as I get until I've earned it properly." He was quiet for a moment. "Then you'll earn it," he said. And he meant it in exactly the way it sounded. Not as a compliment, not as a reassurance, but as a plain statement of what he believed was going to happen. Evelyn looked at the table. She thought about the schoolroom, the cold floor, the 12 desks, the blackboard that needed replacing, and 26 children she hadn't met yet. She thought about Hannah Bauer, who was too fast for what she'd been given, and the Dunn boy who saw letters wrong, and Samuel Reyes, who thought he was too old for school. She thought about Clara Finch saying, "I want them to be able to take care of themselves," and the way that sentence had landed somewhere precise and solid in the middle of Evelyn's chest, because it was the same thing she'd wanted for herself, and hadn't been able to say that plainly until a stranger said it for her in a cold Wyoming schoolroom. Nora came in with bread and set it on the table, and the evening gathered around the three of them, the way evenings do when the day has been long and something good has happened at the end of it, and the lamp made everything warm. Outside, the Wyoming wind was doing what it always did. Inside, Evelyn Hart was figuring out what came next. She started on Monday, as promised, though the weekend before it was not the quiet preparation she'd imagined. Saturday brought 3 inches of snow that nobody in Elk Creek seemed particularly alarmed by, which told Evelyn something useful about the community's relationship with inconvenience. She spent the morning in the schoolroom anyway, having convinced Caleb to drive her out the day before her official start so she could arrange the desks and go through the supply boxes properly. He'd brought tools without being asked: a hammer, a hand plane, a bag of assorted hardware, and while Evelyn sorted books by reading level and made a list of what was missing, he adjusted the 2 problem desks without commentary, working with the unhurried competence of a man who had fixed enough things in his life to find the process unremarkable. "You don't have to do that," she said when she noticed him crouching under the 3rd desk, checking whether the crossbrace was solid. "I know I don't have to." He tapped the joint with his knuckle. "This one's fine. The Bauer girl will sit here, she's small enough." Evelyn stopped sorting. "How did you know I was putting Hannah at this desk?" "Front row, right side, good angle to the blackboard. It's where you'd put your fastest student." He stood up and moved to the next one. "Also, you've been muttering their names to yourself for 20 minutes while you organize." She had not been aware she was doing that. "I don't mutter." "You do, actually. Quietly, but you do." He checked the desk legs. "Hannah, the Dunn boy, what's his name?" "Thomas. Thomas Samuel." He looked at the desk nearest the window. "You're putting Samuel by the window. He needs to feel like there's somewhere to go. Children who think they're trapped make everyone miserable." She went back to the books. "And he's tall. He'll get more light there." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "You think about them like people. They are people. A lot of teachers don't, is what I mean." She glanced at him. He was standing with his hand on the back of the window desk, not quite looking at her, with an expression that suggested he was talking about something specific and not going to explain what it was. She didn't push it. She'd learned over the past week that Caleb Mercer gave information on his own timeline, and pushing only made him more careful. "My father was a teacher," she said. "He talked about his students at dinner the way other people talked about their neighbors. Which ones were struggling? Which ones had something going on at home that was making school harder? He thought it was his job to notice. Did it help? Knowing that about them? I think it helped him. And I think they knew he knew, even when he didn't say anything, and that mattered to them." She set a stack of readers on the front desk. "Children understand more than adults think they do. They're just watching most of the time instead of saying." Caleb looked at her for a moment. "Your father sounds like he was a good man." "He was," she said. He lost most of his eyesight when I was 19. He couldn't teach after that. She kept her voice even. He was very quiet about it. He didn't complain, but you could see it had taken something out of him. The work wasn't just income. It was what he was. She picked up another stack of books. I think that's part of why I take it seriously. Because you watched what happens when it's taken away. Yes, she moved to the next desk, among other reasons. The snow was coming down steadily outside the window, and the stove was throwing heat, and the schoolroom was taking shape around them in the way that rooms do when someone with a purpose is in them. Evelyn worked through the morning and into the afternoon, and Caleb fixed what needed fixing, and fetched what needed fetching, and stayed out of her way otherwise, and it was the most productive Saturday she could remember in some time. Monday arrived the way first days always do, too quickly and too slowly at once. She was up before the snow had fully lightened and had the schoolroom stove going by 7, and she stood at the front of the room with the chalk in her hand and the desks all arranged and the books distributed and her lesson plan written in the notebook she kept in her left coat pocket, and she thought, all right, here we go. They came in at 8 in groups and pairs, stamping snow from their boots at the door with varying degrees of success. 24 of the 26 children from the family furthest out had been kept home because of the road conditions, and a note had been sent with an older sibling to explain, which Evelyn appreciated as a gesture of basic courtesy. Hannah Bauer came in first, which Evelyn had suspected she might. She was 11, with bright dark eyes behind a pair of spectacles that had been repaired at least twice and were sitting slightly crooked on her nose, and she looked around the room with the evaluating thoroughness of someone who had learned early that first impressions were information. She saw Evelyn and stopped. "You moved the desks," she said. "I did. I rearranged them so the light falls better. You'll be here." Evelyn indicated the front right desk. Hannah looked at it, looked at the angle to the blackboard, and sat down with the efficient satisfaction of a child who had just been correctly understood. Thomas Dunn came in with his older brother, who was 11 to Thomas's 7, and had the protective bearing of a child who'd been told to keep an eye on him. Thomas was small for 7, with a round face and the particular darting attention of a child who was used to the world not quite cooperating with him. He looked at the desks, looked at Evelyn, and looked at his brother. "Here," Evelyn said, indicating his desk, which was front and center, closer than it probably looked like it should be, and Thomas sat down without argument, which she took as a small but meaningful sign. Samuel Freyas came in last at 7:59, which was technically on time, but communicated a precise kind of indifference that Evelyn had encountered before and did not find particularly intimidating. He was 13 and already had the rangy, half-assembled look of a boy growing faster than he could keep up with. He saw the desk by the window and looked at Evelyn with a measured suspicion. "That one," he said. "If you want it." He sat in it, arranging his long legs under it with some effort. He looked out the window at the snow. He looked back at Evelyn, and in his expression was the same question every reluctant student ever had. "Convince me this is worth my time." She did not attempt to convince him of anything that morning. She began with something she'd learned from her father. She told them a story. Not a lesson, not a lecture. A story about a man who had come west 20 years ago with $40 and a broken wagon wheel, and had, through a combination of stubbornness and knowing how to do arithmetic in his head, built a freight operation that ran through 4 territories. She told it as a story, not a morality tale, and she didn't stop to explain the arithmetic. She let the numbers exist in the story where they lived, and she watched the room. Samuel stopped looking out the window at around the 3-minute mark. He didn't look entirely convinced, but he was listening. Hannah was taking notes, which Evelyn had not asked her to do. Thomas had his hands pressed flat on his desk, and his eyes fixed on Evelyn's face with the total attention of a child who had finally found a frequency he could tune to. She thought, "All right, we can work with this." The first 3 weeks of March were hard in the way that work is hard when you're doing it right relentlessly, productively, with the specific exhaustion of someone who falls asleep because they've earned it, rather than because they're escaping something. She established her days quickly. She was in the schoolroom by 7 to get the stove going. She taught from 8 to 4 with a break at midday that she used for the younger children who needed individual attention. After 4, she walked through the settlement not formally, just moving through it, which was something she'd learned gave the community a chance to stop her, without the formality of an appointment. Margaret Pruitt had told her in the first week that frontier families didn't come to you with problems. They waited to see if you were the kind of person who came to them. She came to them. She learned which children were behind for structural reasons and which for circumstantial ones. She found out, by the 3rd week, that Thomas Dunn's issue with reading was not a problem with how he understood letters, but with how they moved on the page. For him, he had described it to her one afternoon. haltingly, and with the embarrassment of a child who'd been told he was slow, as the letters jump around when I look at them too long. She'd kept her face neutral and thanked him for telling her, and that evening she'd written a letter to a doctor she'd known in Philadelphia, who specialized in children's learning difficulties, asking for whatever literature he could send her. She told no one about the letter. She just adjusted Thomas's approach. She gave him oral work alongside written work. She let him trace letters in sand before he transferred them to paper. She watched his face rather than the paper to know when he was struggling. Within 2 weeks, he had read his first complete sentence aloud to the class, slowly and with effort, and the silence in the room afterward had been the kind that came from children who understood they had just witnessed something. Caleb rode through Elk Creek on the 14th, moving horses south toward Laramie. He stopped at the schoolhouse after 4 when the children were gone and found Evelyn on the porch with her coat on and a stack of exercise books in her lap, grading in the last of the afternoon light because the lamp in the teacher's quarters was giving her headaches. "How's it going?" he asked, tying his horse to the porch rail. "Ask me in another month." "I'm asking now." She looked up. He looked trail-worn, 2 days of dust and cold and horsework, and he was looking at her with the straightforward attention she'd gotten used to and stopped trying to deflect. "It's going well," she said. "Better than I expected in some ways. Harder in others." She looked down at the exercise books. "Hannah Bauer needs more than I can give her in a one-room schoolhouse. She's finished everything I've assigned and started teaching the younger ones her own method for multiplication, which is actually better than the standard one." "What are you going to do?" "I've written to the county about secondary correspondence courses. They exist. The county provides them for settlements too small for secondary schools. If they approve it, Hannah can work through the material herself with my guidance." She set the book she was holding aside. "It'll be 4 to 6 weeks before I hear back." "She'll be fine in 4 to 6 weeks. She'll be bored in 4 to 6 weeks. There's a difference." She picked up the next book. "I've been giving her extra work, but it's not the same as being genuinely challenged." He leaned against the porch rail. "You take that seriously. Boredom in a smart child is a waste, and waste bothers me." He looked at her for a moment with that look she'd stopped trying to categorize and had started just accepting. "You doing all right out here? Alone?" "I'm not alone. There are 24 children here every day and 7 families around me." "That's not what I meant." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm fine," she said. "I sleep well. I eat what the families bring, which is more than enough. People have been very generous. I have my journal and my lamp and enough work to fill every hour I have." She looked out at the settlement, where smoke was rising from the Pruitt chimney, and a child she recognized as one of the younger Bowers was running across the yard toward the house. "I'm more all right than I've been in a while, actually." He didn't say anything. She appreciated that he didn't say anything, because anything he might have said would have been less than what the silence held. "You look tired," she said, 2 days on the road. "Nora will fix that. I'm going back through in 2 weeks. I'll stop again." She nodded. "The new blackboard section should be here by then. The county's shipping it with the next supply wagon." "Good." He pushed off the rail. "The Reyes family treating you all right?" "Maria Reyes brought me tamales on Friday. I think that means I'm accepted." For the first time she could remember, she saw him actually smile, not the almost smile, not the shoulder movement, but a real one, brief and unguarded, the kind that changed his face entirely for a moment before he got it back under control. "That definitely means you're accepted," he said. "Maria Reyes does not make tamales for people she hasn't decided about." He rode out 20 minutes later, and Evelyn watched him go from the porch, and then went inside and made tea, and sat at the small table in her quarters and graded exercise books, until the lamp was the only light left in the valley. The Harvest Festival came in the second week of April, which was earlier than most harvest festivals because Elk Creek operated on its own calendar, and the Pruitts had decided that the end of the hard weather season was worth celebrating, regardless of what the actual harvest looked like. It was held in the Pruitt barn, which was large enough for the purpose, with tables borrowed from the schoolhouse and every family in the settlement contributing food and drink, and, in the case of Heinrich Bauer, a fiddle he played with tremendous enthusiasm and only moderate skill. Evelyn had been in Elk Creek for 6 weeks by then. She was no longer the new teacher from Philadelphia. She had become, in the gradual and unannounced way of small communities, simply the teacher, and the distinction mattered more than it might sound. It meant the Finch boys stopped watching her from a distance. It meant Samuel Reyes had started staying after school on Tuesdays and Thursdays, not because she'd asked him to, but because he'd discovered, with the particular surprise of a teenager encountering an unexpected interest, that maps engaged him in a way nothing else at school had. It meant that when she walked through the settlement in the evenings, people called out to her by name. She had not thought, a month and a half ago, that she would feel anything like belonging anywhere in Wyoming. She arrived at the Pruitt barn with a dish of scalloped potatoes. Margaret had helped her make because Evelyn's first attempt had been, in her own assessment, technically edible, but not festive. The barn was already warm and full. When she got there, lanterns hung from the rafters, throwing golden light across the faces of the families she knew. The children running in the chaotic way children ran when they'd been given permission to. Heinrich Bauer already positioned in the corner with his fiddle making a sound that was enthusiastic enough to qualify as music on the broader definition. She found Clara Finch first because Clara was easy to find. She was always near her boys, not hovering, just positioned. The older boy, Jesse, was chasing someone across the barn with a look of pure joyful idiocy that reminded Evelyn that he was, despite his careful classroom demeanor, 9 years old and made mostly of energy. "He's been looking forward to this for 2 weeks," Clara said, watching him. "He should be. He's worked hard this month." Clara turned to look at her. She had a quality Evelyn had come to appreciate. She accepted compliments about her children without deflecting them. "The letter writing," she said. "He asked me to read his last one. About the wagon roads. It was good, clear. He organized his argument. He told me you made him do it over twice." "I did. First version was fine. Second version was his." Clara smiled. "You're harder than I expected. Is that a complaint?" "No," Clara said. "It's a relief." They moved to the food tables, and Evelyn was halfway through filling a plate when she became aware of a change in the room's atmosphere, that she couldn't immediately account for a slight shift in the quality of the noise. A few heads turning toward the door, the particular recalibration that happened when someone new arrived, who changed the social temperature of a room. She turned around. The woman who had come through the barn door was somewhere in her mid-30s, wearing a traveling dress that had no business being in a Wyoming barn and knew it. She was pretty in the specific cultivated way that required maintenance, with dark hair dressed in a style that suggested recent city access. The man beside her was older, well-dressed, with the settled confidence of someone who was accustomed to being the most financially comfortable person in any given room. The woman's eyes moved through the crowd with a practiced efficiency and landed, after perhaps 10 seconds, on Caleb Mercer. Caleb had come in earlier than Evelyn had noticed and was standing near the far wall talking to Abner Pruitt about something neither of them seemed particularly animated about. He went still when he saw the woman, with a quality of stillness that was different from his usual stillness. It was the stillness of someone who had been surprised by something they would have preferred not to be surprised by. Margaret Pruitt appeared at Evelyn's elbow with the uncanny timing of a woman who tracked everything happening in a room simultaneously. "Vivian Caldwell," she said quietly. "Nay Hobart. She grew up in this county, moved to Denver 6 years ago and married well, as she's sure to make clear." A pause. She and Caleb had an understanding before she left. She chose the other option. Evelyn kept her face neutral. "I see. The man with her is her husband, Gerald Caldwell. He made his money in mining equipment." Margaret's voice was entirely even. "She comes back every spring to visit her mother. Usually stays 3 days. Usually makes Caleb considerably less pleasant company for about a week afterward." Evelyn looked at Caleb. He'd recovered from the first moment of stillness and was doing the thing he did when he wanted to seem unaffected by something, settled, expression managed. Attention kept deliberately on what was directly in front of him. She had seen that particular posture twice before, and both times it had meant that something was bothering him more than he intended to show. "She doesn't look like she chose incorrectly," Evelyn said, meaning the husband. "Gerald Caldwell is a perfectly good man," Margaret said, "and Vivian is not a villain. She just likes to know that what she didn't take is still there." She patted Evelyn's arm once, briefly, and moved away. Evelyn finished filling her plate and found a seat beside the Reyes family, and the festival went on around her. Heinrich Bauer played 3 songs that were recognizable and 2 that might have been improvised. The children ate too much and ran in circles and eventually wound down to the sprawled exhaustion of the very young. Clara Finch's younger boy fell asleep under one of the tables, and nobody moved him. Vivian Caldwell worked her way through the room with the practiced ease of a woman who had been trained to be charming in groups, and Gerald Caldwell followed her with the amiable tolerance of a man who had made this same circuit many times and didn't mind it. Evelyn watched without appearing to watch, and saw the moment Vivian arrived in front of Caleb and the moment Caleb shook Gerald's hand with complete equanimity and said something that made Gerald laugh. What Caleb did not do was smile at Vivian. She noticed that. She was noticing too many things about Caleb Mercer, she thought, and turned her attention back to her plate. Vivian found her, of course. That was perhaps inevitable. Like Vivian Caldwell had a talent for identifying the thing in a room that required examination, and Evelyn, as the unknown quantity, was that thing. She came with a smile that was genuinely excellent, warm, interested. not immediately telegraphing anything other than sociability, and sat beside Evelyn on the bench, with the ease of someone entirely comfortable taking up whatever space they wanted. "You must be the new teacher," she said. "I've heard about you." "Vivian Caldwell," Evelyn said. "I've heard about you as well." A small pause. The smile adjusted slightly, becoming more precise. "Good things, I hope. Informative things," Evelyn said pleasantly. Vivian laughed genuinely, it seemed, which elevated her slightly in Evelyn's estimation. "I like you already," she said. "You came from Philadelphia?" "Yes. As a mail-order bride?" She said it with studied casualness, which meant she'd been thinking about how to say it. "I came as a mail-order bride," Evelyn said. "The arrangement dissolved when I arrived, and I'm now the teacher for the Elk Creek settlement. Both facts are accurate, and I have the same relationship to both of them." Vivian tilted her head. "That's a remarkably settled way to talk about it." "I've had 6 weeks to settle. It's been sufficient." Evelyn looked at her directly. "Was there something you wanted to ask me, Mrs. Caldwell?" Another small recalibration. "I wanted to meet you," Vivian said. "Caleb spoke of you." Evelyn's chest did something she immediately told it to stop doing. "Did he?" "Caleb doesn't talk about people he doesn't think about," Vivian said, with the particular authority of someone who knew him from an earlier chapter. "He mentioned you 3 times in 20 minutes when I spoke to him earlier, which for Caleb is practically an announcement." Evelyn said nothing. She picked up her fork. "You're not going to ask me what he said," Vivian observed. "No." "Why not?" "Because if he wanted me to know what he said, he'd tell me himself." "And because," Evelyn added, with care, "I don't think it's what you're actually trying to tell me." Vivian was quiet for a moment. She looked across the barn to where Caleb was now talking to one of the Bauer sons, and something crossed her face that was too complicated to be simple nostalgia, and too honest to be performance. "I made the right choice," she said. "For myself. I want you to know that." She didn't look at Evelyn when she said it. She was still watching Caleb. "Gerald is a good man, and I love him, and I made the right choice." She finally looked over. "But Caleb Mercer is the best man I have ever known in my life, and I wasted 2 years being too interested in what I didn't have to fully understand what was in front of me. And I am telling you this not to cause you distress, but because I am 34 years old, and I have learned that certain things are worth saying plainly." Evelyn set her fork down. She looked at Vivian Caldwell carefully, the way she looked at everything she needed to truly understand, rather than simply respond to. "I don't have a claim on him," she said. "I know you don't." "I'm not talking about claims," Vivian straightened. "I'm talking about paying attention to what's actually in front of you before it becomes something you say you should have noticed." She stood up. "You're very composed, Miss Hart. That's a quality. Don't let it become a habit that costs you something." She nodded once pleasantly and moved away. Evelyn sat with her plate and her thoughts for a long moment. Heinrich Bauer had started a new song. One of the Finch boys went past at full speed, with Samuel Reyes in laughing pursuit, which was the most animated she'd ever seen Samuel look, and she was going to hold on to that image for the days when he went back to staring out the window. Across the barn, Caleb looked up and found her sitting there, and held her gaze for a moment with that direct, unhurried attention of his, and then looked back at whoever he'd been talking to. She thought about what Vivian had said. She thought about what she'd said back. She thought about 6 weeks in a small schoolroom, and 24 children, and letters to Philadelphia and tamales from Maria Reyes, and the way certain things, without asking permission, had begun to matter to her in ways she hadn't budgeted for. She was not a woman who romanticized situations. She was not a woman who let hope outrun evidence. She had come to Wyoming for a practical reason that had not worked out, and she had made something else from the wreckage, and she was proud of that and intended to keep building it. But she was also a woman who noticed things, and she had been noticing things. She stood up, picked up her empty plate, and carried it to the table where Clara Finch was supervising the desserts with the resigned efficiency of a woman who knew the children were going to eat too much, and had already made peace with it. "You all right?" Clara asked without looking up from cutting pie. "Yes," Evelyn said then mostly. Clara glanced at her sideways. "Vivian Caldwell talked to you?" "For a few minutes. She talks to everyone she's curious about. She's not malicious, she's just interested in everything." Clara handed a piece of pie to her older boy. "Don't let her rearrange anything you've already sorted out." Evelyn accepted a piece of pie. "I won't." But she went home that night to the small room behind the schoolhouse and sat for a long time at the table, with her journal open and the lamp burning, and nothing written on the page, which for her was the equivalent of a considerable amount of noise. Caleb came back through on the 28th as he'd said he would. He came in the late afternoon when school had just let out, and the last of the children were dispersing, and Evelyn was on the porch in her coat, the better boots. By now well worn with the blackboard replacement she'd been waiting for, propped against the wall beside her, finally arrived that morning. He tied his horse and came up the porch steps and looked at the blackboard section, and then at her. It got here, she said. I see that took 6 weeks. That's fast for the county. He looked at her. Something in his face was not quite the same as the last time she'd seen him. Not wrong exactly, just different in a way she couldn't immediately locate. How was the festival? Good. The Finch boys ate enough to last a week. Samuel Reyes? He chased Jesse Finch across the barn for 20 minutes, and I saw him laugh twice. Both of those are precedents. Caleb almost smiled. What did Vivian say to you? She'd known he was going to ask. She'd been thinking about how she'd answer for 2 weeks. She told me she made the right choice for herself, Evelyn said. And she said some things about you that were kind and probably true. She shouldn't have said anything about me. She thought it was useful. I'm not sure she was wrong. She looked at him directly. Does it bother you that she came back? He was quiet for a moment. He had his hands in his coat pockets and his hat pulled down against the wind, and he was looking at the middle distance in a way that meant he was deciding whether to say the real thing or the easy thing. It used to, he said, less now. He looked at her. She picked the life she wanted. I understand that. It took me a while to stop being angry about it and just accept it as a fact. And now? And now it's a fact. He held her gaze. I'm not still in love with her, Evelyn. I haven't been for a long time. She felt the deliberateness of him saying her name, which he rarely did. It was not casual, it was chosen. I didn't ask that, she said. No, he said. But you were thinking it, and I'd rather say a true thing you're thinking than let a false thing sit in the space. She looked at him, standing on her porch in the afternoon light that was getting longer, now that spring was properly arriving. His horse tied to the rail, and the blackboard propped against the wall, and 24 children dispersed across the valley toward their homes. You're a strange man to know, she said. I've been told that before. It's not a complaint. He looked at her for a moment. Something in the air between them had the quality of a question that neither of them had put into words yet, and both of them knew it, and neither of them was in enough of a hurry to do something careless about it. I'll help you hang the blackboard before I go, he said. I know you will, she said. She went inside to get the hammer, and he took his coat off and rolled up his sleeves despite the cold, and together they hung the new blackboard straight on the first try, which was not how most things went but was how this one did. And afterward they stood back and looked at it in the empty room, with the afternoon light coming through the windows, and Evelyn thought that 6 weeks ago she had been sitting on a train platform in the cold reading a letter that had ended one version of her life. She was finding, incrementally and without fanfare, that she preferred this one. She picked up a piece of chalk and wrote on the new board, in her careful schoolteacher's hand, the date, April 28, 1887. Caleb looked at it. First thing on the new board. Seemed right to mark it. He looked at her. Yes, he said. It did. May came in quietly without the drama of April's late snows, and the valley around Elk Creek softened in a way that Evelyn hadn't anticipated, the brown and gray of winter giving way not all at once but gradually, patch by patch, the way conviction changes rather than the way weather does. She noticed it the morning she walked out to the porch for her early coffee, and found the field behind the schoolhouse had gone from mud to something tentatively green overnight. She stood with her cup and looked at it for a long moment before going back inside, and the thought she had was not poetic, it was practical. The children would be harder to keep indoors. She'd need to build more outdoor work into the lessons. Geography could happen outside. Natural observation could be formalized. Samuel Reyes already knew the names of every bird that came through the valley. She could use that. She went inside and added a note to her lesson plan for the week, and the day began the way her days began now, with purpose, with work, with the particular satisfaction of a life that fit the shape of the person living it. What she did not let herself think about in those early mornings was Caleb. That was not precisely true, but it was what she told herself, and the gap between those two things had been widening since the festival, since Vivian Caldwell's careful words, since the afternoon they'd hung the blackboard together, and he'd held her gaze a moment longer than necessary before putting his coat back on and riding out. She was a practical woman. She had built her current life out of the wreckage of a failed arrangement, and she had learned something from that process that she intended to keep. She would not organize herself around a man's intentions until those intentions were made explicit. She would not read subtext as text. She would not let hope do the work that evidence was supposed to do. So she taught her 24 students, and she walked her evening routes through the settlement, and she wrote her letters and graded her exercise books, and helped Thomas Dunn learn to read sentences without the letters jumping. And she waited, with the patience she'd developed the hard way, to see what the next thing actually was before deciding how to feel about it. The letter from the county regarding Hannah Bauer's correspondence courses arrived on the 6th of May, which was a Thursday, and Evelyn had been checking for it every supply day for 3 weeks. She read it twice, standing at the front of the schoolroom. before the children arrived, and then set it on her desk and did not allow herself to feel pleased until she'd confirmed that she'd understood it correctly. She had. The county had approved the arrangement. Secondary-level correspondence materials in mathematics and natural science would begin arriving with the monthly supply wagon starting in June. Hannah was to be formally enrolled as a distance student of Fremont County secondary education, with Evelyn as her supervising instructor. When Hannah arrived at 8:10 that morning, Evelyn waited until the class was settled, and then called her to the front and told her in front of everyone. Hannah stood very still for a moment. She pushed her crooked spectacles up her nose. Does that mean real courses? Like what they do in town schools? Better than what some town schools do, Evelyn said. It means real mathematics, algebra, geometry eventually, and natural science that actually goes somewhere. Hannah looked at her desk. She looked at the class. She looked at Evelyn. My father will need to know. I've written to your father already. He should receive the letter today. Hannah sat back down and she opened her reader, and she said nothing else. But for the rest of that morning, she had the particular compressed quality of someone who was containing something too large for the room. And at the midday break, she came to Evelyn's desk and said, very quietly, and without looking directly at her, "Thank you, Miss Hart. You did the work that made it possible," Evelyn said. "I just wrote the letter." Hannah went outside. Evelyn watched her go and thought about her father losing his sight at her kitchen table in Philadelphia, going quiet in the way of a man whose life had been taken from him piece by piece, and she thought, this is why. This is exactly why. She picked up the next set of papers to grade and got back to it. Caleb came through again in the middle of May on a Wednesday, and this time he didn't stay the night at the Pruitts', but came to the schoolhouse at the end of the afternoon and stayed for dinner, which was a departure from his previous pattern, and which both of them acknowledged without acknowledging, in the way they'd gotten practiced at. Evelyn made what she had, which was a bean soup that Margaret had taught her, and a half loaf of bread left from the morning, and they ate at the small table in her quarters, with the door propped open to catch the May evening air. It was the first time they'd eaten together without other people present, which should not have been remarkable, and was anyway. The county approved Hannah's courses, she said, I heard. Heinrich Bauer told half the valley within 12 hours of getting your letter. Something moved in his expression. He doesn't show things easily, but he was moved by it. I know, she said. He came to find me after school that day. He stood in the doorway for about 30 seconds not saying anything, and then he said it was a good thing and left. She looked at her soup. That was enough. Caleb was quiet for a moment. You're good at this. I know what I'm doing. That's not the same as being good at it. It is, actually. Most people who know what they're doing still manage to do it badly. She looked at him. That's a philosophical position I don't entirely agree with. Most philosophical positions worth having are worth disagreeing about. She almost laughed. Where did that come from? My mother. He broke off a piece of bread. She said it about arguments she was having with my father. She said it was a good sign if you disagreed about something, because it meant you both thought it mattered. Your mother sounds like she was formidable. She was. She was also wrong about half the things she was certain about, which she'd have told you herself. He looked at the bread. She died when I was 23. Fever, fast. I'm sorry. Nora was 20. I came back from a horse run to find out it was already over. He said it evenly, but in the way of someone who had worked at being even about it for a long time. The thing I've never quite gotten past is that she died thinking I was on the road somewhere. I wasn't with her. Evelyn looked at him. Did she know you loved her? Yes, then she wasn't alone in the way that matters. He was quiet for a moment. My father used to say things like that. I never knew whether he believed them or just needed to. They can both be true at the same time, Evelyn said. Something can be the thing you need to believe and also be actually true. He looked at her across the table. The evening light was going, and the lamp on the table was doing the rest of the work, and it was the kind of light that made it harder to look away from a person than it was to look at them. Evelyn, he said, and stopped. She waited. He looked at the table. He looked back at her. I'm going to say something, and I want you to tell me if I'm wrong. All right. I've been coming through Elk Creek more often than my business requires. He said it plainly, with the slightly labored quality of someone who was making themselves be direct about something they would have preferred to approach from a distance. I've been doing that since March, and I think you know why, and I think I know that you know, and I'd rather say it than keep not saying it. She was very still, not with the stillness of someone who was surprised, but with the stillness of someone who was paying complete attention. I'm not going to tell you what to do with it, he said. You've built something here that's yours, and I have no intention of complicating that. But I think about you, considerably. He picked up his coffee cup and set it back down without drinking. More than I've thought about anyone in a long time. The lamp threw a small circle of light. Outside, the valley was making its evening sounds, the creek at the edge of the settlement, Something bird-related that Samuel could have named, the distant close of a door somewhere in the direction of the Pruitt place. Evelyn looked at her hands on the table. She thought about being on a train platform in February with a letter nailed to a post and $68, and no idea what came next. She thought about deciding, in a cold boarding house room in a strange town, that she was not going to let someone else's cowardice write the end of her story. She thought about what she'd promised herself, about not reading subtext as text, about waiting for evidence. Here was the evidence. "I think about you too," she said. "I have been trying not to because I wasn't sure what to do with it." And because she stopped and then made herself continue, because she was asking him for honesty, and she owed him the same. "Because the last time I organized any part of my life around a man's intentions, I ended up on a train platform. So I've been careful, that's reasonable," he said. "It's not a no," she said. "I know it isn't." He looked at her. "I'm not asking for an answer to a question I haven't asked yet. I'm just telling you the true thing." She looked at him for a long moment. "The true thing is helpful," she said. "In my experience, there's not enough of it." He almost smiled. "No, there isn't." They finished dinner without resolving anything, because there was nothing yet to resolve. What had been said was the beginning of something, not the thing itself, and both of them were people who understood the difference between naming a direction and arriving somewhere. But the table felt different after, and the lamp seemed steadier, and when he got up to leave and she walked with him to where his horse was tied at the porch rail, the May evening had the specific quality of air that has been changed by something that just happened in it. "I'll be back through in 3 weeks," he said, untying the reins. "I know," she said. He paused. He looked at her in the evening dark with the expression she had stopped trying to categorize. Then he said, "You look like you belong here." She considered that. "I think I do," she said. He nodded once, mounted, and rode out of the valley, and Evelyn stood on the porch until the sound of hooves faded and then went inside and sat at the table for a long time without doing anything in particular. She didn't write in her journal. She didn't grade papers. She just sat in her own space in a valley that had become hers and let the evening settle around her, and felt, in a way that was neither dramatic nor simple, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. June arrived with its longer days, and the particular noise of children who understood instinctively and without being told that the end of the school term was approaching and that something about the air had changed. The Bauer children brought wildflowers on a Monday and put them in the empty ink jar on Evelyn's desk without explanation, which was the kind of gesture that didn't require one. Thomas Dunn read a full paragraph aloud on a Tuesday and didn't look to Evelyn for confirmation. Afterward, he looked at the page and then at the class, and his expression was the expression of someone who had done a hard thing and knew it. She had been writing monthly reports to Holt and Cottonwood as required, factual and organized, and in the June report, she wrote what she hadn't let herself fully articulate before, that the children were making genuine progress, that the community had been supportive in ways that exceeded the formal arrangement, and that she intended to apply for renewal of the position for the following year. She sent the letter on a Friday and felt lighter for having sent it. The Hannah Bauer situation had, in the way of things that were right, quietly resolved itself. The first correspondence materials had arrived with the June supply wagon, and Hannah had taken the mathematics primer and the natural science reader with the reverence of a child receiving something she'd been waiting for without knowing she was waiting for it. She sat in the front of the room and worked through her new material while managing the younger students' reading groups with a competence that Evelyn found, on her more honest days, slightly humbling. "She's going to outgrow Elk Creek," Evelyn said to Margaret Pruitt one afternoon in early June, when the two of them were walking back from the Finch place where they'd gone to discuss Jessie's reading progress with Clara. "Probably," Margaret said. "That doesn't bother you?" "Why would it bother me?" Margaret stepped over a creek stone without breaking stride. "The point is to give children enough to go somewhere with. If Hannah goes somewhere, that means it worked." She looked at Evelyn sideways. "You have the same problem some teachers have." "What problem?" "You think success means they stay. It doesn't. Success means they're ready when it's time to go." Evelyn thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. She thought about her father's students who'd gone to secondary school because of his extra hours. She thought about herself in a boarding house in Cottonwood, deciding that a failed arrangement didn't have to mean a failed life. She thought about being ready when it was time to go. The trouble with Douglas Fitch arrived in the second week of June, and it arrived, as trouble often did, through no direct action of anyone in Elk Creek but from the outside, wearing respectable clothes. It came in the form of a man named Harlan Wick, who was a land agent out of Cheyenne, and who arrived in Elk Creek on a Thursday with paperwork that he presented to Abner Pruitt over the kitchen table in a manner that was polite on the surface and had something else entirely underneath it. The paperwork claimed that a section of the eastern grazing land, 120 acres, that included the portion Abner had been using for the past 8 years, where Caleb ran horses through on his Laramie trips, was subject to an outstanding claim by the Territorial Land Authority that superseded Pruitt's original deed. Evelyn heard about it from Margaret the following morning. When Margaret came to the schoolhouse before class started with a face that was controlled and a voice that was steady and a quality of barely suppressed fury that Evelyn recognized because she'd seen it in her own mirror the morning after the train platform. "He's been farming here for 8 years, Evelyn said. The original deed had a surveying error, or so this Wick is claiming. Margaret sat down on one of the student desks, which she would never have done if she weren't genuinely rattled. The authority is saying the error invalidates the claim on those acres. Can they do that? Wick says they can. He showed Abner papers. She pressed her lips together. Abner's been up all night. Evelyn sat across from her. Who is the Territorial Land Authority? A county-level office. They have jurisdiction over disputed land claims. Margaret's voice was careful, but Abner's been paying taxes on those acres for 8 years. He's built fence on them. He's run cattle and allowed Caleb's horses through. There's a record. Is there a lawyer in Cottonwood? One, Edgar Pratt. He's adequate for most things. She looked at Evelyn. I came to you because you think clearly when things go wrong. And because Caleb needs to know, and he's due through in 2 weeks, and Abner won't send word because he's too proud. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She thought about what she knew, which was limited, and what she could find out, which was more than Abner was likely to pursue on his own. I'll write to Holt today, she said. He knows the county. He'll know whether this authority has done this kind of thing before. She paused. And I'll send word to Caleb through the livery in Cottonwood. They know his route. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, Evelyn said, with the deliberate echo of a phrase she'd heard enough times to know where it came from. I want to. Margaret looked at her. Something in her face that was not usually soft went soft for a moment. You've become part of this place, she said. I know, Evelyn said. It was not a boast. It was a plain statement of a fact that she had arrived at slowly and intended to keep. The letter to Holt went out Thursday. The message to the Cottonwood livery went out Friday. By Saturday, Harlan Wick had paid a second visit to the Pruitt place with additional documentation, in a manner that had shifted from polite to pressuring. He wanted an answer by the end of June, he said, and the answer he wanted was a deed transfer for the disputed acres at a price he was prepared to offer. Abner had told him he needed time. Wick had said time was not in unlimited supply. Evelyn was in the schoolroom Saturday morning, working through the week's grading, when Samuel Reyes appeared in the doorway. This was unusual. Saturday was not a school day. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and the expression of a teenager who had something to say and was working out whether to say it. Samuel, she said, come in. He came in and stood in front of her desk. He was taller than he'd been in February, which was the way of 13-year-olds. My mother told me about Mr. Pruitt's land, he said. I know, she said. That man from Cheyenne is saying, there's a surveying error. That's what he's claiming, yes. There isn't one. Samuel said it with the direct certainty of a teenager who was accustomed to adults not listening to him, and was going to say it anyway. I know those acres. I've walked every line of that property since I was 8 years old. My father surveyed the eastern boundary himself when he was establishing the sheep pasture. He kept the records. Evelyn set down her pen. Your father surveyed it? He was a surveyor before he was a rancher. In New Mexico. He had instruments and he knew how to use them. Samuel looked at his hat. He died 4 years ago, but my mother kept his papers. Everything. The room was very quiet. Samuel, Evelyn said carefully. Does your mother know you're here? She sent me, he said. She said if anyone would know what to do with the papers, it would be you. Evelyn stood up. Tell your mother I'll come this afternoon. He nodded and left, and Evelyn stood in the middle of the schoolroom and looked at the ceiling for a moment, with the very specific feeling of a situation that had just shifted from difficult to possibly manageable, which was not the same as easy, but was an entirely different category of problem. Maria Reyes's papers were organized with the meticulous precision of a woman who had understood from the beginning that documentation was the only protection a family like hers could count on in a place that had not always been certain to treat them fairly. The survey records were in a tin box wrapped in oilskin, and they were complete field notes in Rafael Reyes's careful hand, compass readings, chain measurements, and a final plot that showed the Pruitt eastern boundary in exact agreement with the original deed. Evelyn sat at Maria's kitchen table with the papers spread before her and felt the particular cold clarity she always felt when a problem became concrete enough to address. This is the counter-evidence, she said. This directly contradicts Wick's claim of a surveying error. Maria Reyes sat across from her with her hands flat on the table. She was not a woman who expressed things easily, but her stillness had a quality of intensity that communicated what words would have been insufficient for. My husband spent 3 days on that survey, she said. He was proud of it. He told Abner it was accurate, and Abner trusted him. He was right, too. Evelyn looked at the plot carefully. The measurements are clear and consistent. If there's a disputed survey, Wick's version is the incorrect one. She looked up. I need to send these to Holt with my letter. Or better, I need to bring them to him directly. When? Monday, on the supply wagon, she paused. Would you allow me to take them? I'll keep them safe. Maria looked at her for a long moment, the measuring look of a woman who had learned that trust was not a cheap commodity. You've earned it, she said finally, which was not a small thing from Maria Reyes, and they both knew it. Caleb arrived Saturday evening. He had gotten the message through the livery faster than she'd expected. He'd been only a day out of Cottonwood, heading north, and he'd turned around. He came to the schoolhouse at dusk and tied his horse at the rail and knocked, which he'd never done before. And when Evelyn opened the door, his face had the look of a man who had been riding hard and thinking harder. Tell me what you know, he said. She told him. All of it: Wick's visit, the deed claim, the pressure for a transfer, and then Samuel and Maria Reyes and the tin box with the survey papers that were currently in Evelyn's saddlebag under the bed. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Reyes's survey, he said, complete. Field notes, measurements, final plot. Rafael Reyes was a trained surveyor. I know he was. Abner told me that years ago. He sat down on the porch step with the particular heaviness of a man who'd been on a horse all day and was allowing himself 30 seconds of not being in motion. Wick's been through this county before. 2 years ago, a family north of here, the Allens, had a similar claim made against their water rights. They didn't have documentation, and they ended up selling at a loss. That's a pattern, Evelyn said. Yes, he said, it is. Holt needs to know that too. He looked at her. You're going to Cottonwood Monday, on the supply wagon. With Maria's papers, I'll ride with you. She looked at him sitting on her porch step in the last light of the evening, travel-worn and direct, and she thought about what he'd said 3 weeks ago at this same table, about thinking about her considerably. She thought about the distance between saying a true thing and knowing what to do with it. You turned around on a horse run for this, she said. The horses can wait a day. He looked up at her. Pruitt's been good to me for years. And this matters. Is that the only reason? He held her gaze. No, he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, I have soup left from dinner. Come inside. He came inside. They sat at the small table with the lamp between them, and she put soup in front of him, and he ate it with the unceremonious appetite of someone who'd missed a meal and didn't pretend otherwise. And they talked through what needed to happen Monday, what to say to Holt, how to present the Reyes papers, whether to push Holt on the pattern with the Allen family. It was practical. It was specific. It was the kind of conversation that happened between people who were working the same problem and trusted each other to think clearly. It was also, and she noticed this without deciding to notice it, the most comfortable she had been in someone else's company in a very long time. Monday came with a clear sky and a supply wagon driver named Pete, who talked about weather for the first 20 minutes and then went quiet in the way of men who had delivered things to enough people to know that some passengers needed the silence more than the conversation. Evelyn had the tin box in her saddlebag. Caleb rode alongside the wagon on his horse, which was not unusual for a man who was going the same direction and didn't like riding in wagons. Holt received them at 9 o'clock, with the precise courtesy of a man who had learned that people who came to his office unannounced usually had something that mattered. He looked at the Reyes papers carefully, spread on his desk, and he did not rush the looking. These are thorough, he said. Rafael Reyes was a trained surveyor, Evelyn said, from New Mexico. The measurements are internally consistent and agree with the original Pruitt deed. Wick is claiming the original deed contains a surveying error. These papers refute that directly. Holt looked at Caleb. You mentioned the Allen situation in Cottonwood last winter. I did, Caleb said. Similar approach. Land agent from Cheyenne. Disputed claim. Family without sufficient documentation sold at a loss. Holt was quiet for a moment. He pulled a different file from his cabinet and set it beside the Reyes papers, and looked at the two things together with the deliberate attention of a man who was putting two items in a sequence and not liking what the sequence implied. I'll need to write to the territorial office, he said. This is above my direct jurisdiction, but I can make a formal inquiry and attach the Reyes documentation as counter-evidence. He paused. It will take time. How much time? Evelyn asked. 3 to 4 weeks for a response if I push. He looked at her. Wick set an end-of-June deadline? That's what Pruitt told us. Then I'll push. He closed the file. Miss Hart, would you be willing to make a written statement about what you know of the Reyes family's history with this land? A teacher's attestation has weight. Yes, she said. I'll write it today before I go back. He nodded. He looked at Caleb. You've been moving horses through that eastern section for years. 5 years under the Pruitt agreement. A statement from you as well. Already planning on it. Holt put his hands flat on the desk and looked at the papers in front of him. I won't promise anything, he said. But this is considerably more than Wick was likely expecting to find. Evelyn thought about Maria Reyes sending her son across the valley on a Saturday morning because she trusted the teacher to know what to do. She thought about a tin box wrapped in oilskin, kept for 4 years against the possibility of a day like this one. Good, she said. Then let's write the statements. They were back in Elk Creek by late afternoon. Caleb rode in beside the wagon and tied his horse at the Pruitt place, while Evelyn went to return the tin box to Maria personally and tell her what Holt had said. Maria listened with her arms folded and her face composed and then said, very quietly, Raphael would have been glad to know the survey was useful. It was more than useful, Evelyn said. It was the thing. Maria looked at her. You didn't have to take this on. I know I didn't have to. She said it without thinking, and then heard the echo of it and almost smiled. It's what you do for a community you're part of. Maria looked at her for a long moment. Then she unfolded her arms and went to the kitchen and came back with a plate covered in a cloth and held it out. For your dinner, she said. Evelyn took the plate. Under the cloth were tamales. She carried them back to the schoolhouse in the June evening, past the creek and the Bower place, and the Finch boys who were doing something inadvisable with a stick and a wagon wheel in the yard, past the settlement that had been a name in a letter 2 months ago and was now the shape of her daily life. Caleb was sitting on the porch steps when she got there. How did Maria take it, he said, quietly. The way she takes everything. Evelyn sat down on the steps beside him. It was a small porch, and the step was not wide, and sitting beside him meant sitting close enough that she was aware of the specific quality of his stillness. She gave me tamales. That's the second time, I know. She set the plate between them. Take one. He did. They sat on the porch step in the June evening and ate tamales without discussing what the gesture meant, because they both already understood, and the evening light was the long gold kind that came late in June and made the valley look like something that ought to be preserved. Thank you, she said, for turning around. You'd have done it without me. I'd have done it differently without you. She looked at the field that had gone green since May. Holt listens to you in a way he doesn't quite listen to me yet. He listened to you. He listened more with both of us there. Caleb was quiet for a moment. That's going to change. The longer you're here, I know, she said. That's not a complaint. She paused. I like being here, Caleb. I like it more than I expected to, and I expected to like it a great deal. She looked at him sideways. I want you to know that. Whatever else isn't, I want you to know that I'm not here by accident anymore. I'm here because I chose it. He looked at her. In the evening light, with the tamales between them and the creek making its sound in the middle distance, and the Finch boys still doing whatever they were doing with the wagon wheel, she could see in his face the plain, unguarded version of what he generally kept managed and controlled. I know, he said. I can see it. I just wanted to say it. He nodded slowly. I'm glad you did. They sat on the step a while longer. The light changed. The Finch boys went inside. The valley went quiet in the way it did at the end of day, the particular quiet of a place that had been full of people and was now returning to itself, with the day's work done and everything still standing. Evelyn thought about train platforms and cold mornings and Holt's office and Margaret Pruitt's kitchen and Hannah Bauer taking notes when she hadn't been asked, and Thomas Dunn reading a paragraph without looking for confirmation and Samuel Reyes knowing the name of every bird in the valley. She thought about the shape a life could take when it stops being the life someone else had designed for it. I need to finish the week's grading, she said finally. I know, he stood up and brushed the dust from his coat. I'm staying at the Pruitts tonight. I'll ride out in the morning. I'll be up, she said. Come by before you go. He looked at her. All's right, he said. He walked toward the Pruitt place in the last of the light, and Evelyn watched him for a moment and then went inside and sat at her table with the grating in front of her and the lamp burning, and worked steadily through the evening with the particular settled feeling of someone who knew, without drama and without ceremony, exactly where they were. He came by the schoolhouse at 7, as he'd said he would. Evelyn was on the porch with her coffee, already dressed, already thinking through the week's lessons, because that was who she was, and she had stopped apologizing for it. The morning was the clear, still kind that June occasionally produced between the windy stretches, the valley holding its breath, the light coming slow and gold over the eastern ridge, the creek making a sound you could only hear when everything else went quiet. Caleb tied his horse at the rail and came up the steps with his hat in his hand, and the look of a man who had slept adequately but not well, which she recognized because she'd had the same night. Coffee, she said. I already had some at the Pruitts. Sit down anyway. He sat on the step below her, which put him slightly lower, and she thought it was typical of him to take the smaller position without noticing he was doing it. He looked out at the valley with the same regard she'd been giving it, and they sat for a moment in the particular ease of people who had gotten comfortable enough with each other that silence required no management. You should know, he said, that I sent a second letter to Holt last night, through Abner. I asked him to specifically look at whether Wick has filed similar claims in the Northern County territories, not just what we already know about the Allens. She looked at him sideways. When did you write it? After dinner. I didn't see a lamp on. I used Pruitt's lamp. He paused. I should have mentioned I was going to do it. No, she said. It was the right thing to do. I should have thought of it myself. She looked at her coffee. The Northern Territories, you think there's more than the Allen situation? I think a man like Wick doesn't develop a method from one use. You refine something because you've done it before and it worked. He looked at the ridge. If there's a pattern across multiple counties, Holt's inquiry becomes a different kind of document. It stops being one family's land dispute and starts being evidence of coordinated fraud. And coordinated fraud is a territorial matter, not just a county one, which changes who has jurisdiction and who has authority to act. He turned his hat in his hands. It takes longer, but it's harder to dismiss. She thought about Maria Reyes and her tin box. She thought about the Allen family, who'd sold at a loss because they hadn't had what Maria had. She thought about how many other families might have been in that same position, with the same absence of documentation, and the same man arriving, with the same polished paperwork and the same end-of-month deadline. I'll write to Holt myself today, she said. I'll ask him to look at it from the teacher's angle, any settlements that lost families after a land dispute in the last 3 years. Schools that went from enrolled to empty. A school closing is the most visible sign that a community has been broken apart. He looked at her. That's a good angle. It's the angle I have. She set her coffee cup down. Wick picked settlements because small communities are easier to pressure. The families don't have the same resources as town operations, and they're often too proud or too afraid to ask for help outside the community. She paused. That's what Abner was doing, sitting on it because he was ashamed, as if the fraud was somehow his failure. A lot of men do that, and it's exactly what Wick is counting on. Caleb was quiet for a moment. You see it clearly. I see it because I've been the woman sitting on a train platform, deciding whether to be ashamed of something that wasn't her fault, she said. The mechanism is the same. Make the target feel that the situation reflects on them, and they'll manage the problem quietly rather than loudly. She looked at the valley. The answer is to be loud. He almost smiled. How loud are you planning on being? Professionally loud, she said. The kind of loud that comes with documentation and a clear chain of reasoning. Holt will like that better than the other kind, I know. That's why it's the kind I'm using. She stood up and picked up her coffee cup and looked at him sitting on the step with his hat still in his hands, looking up at her with that expression she'd stopped trying to name, but recognized as thoroughly as she recognized anything. You should ride before it gets hot, she said. I know, he didn't move immediately. I'll be back in 2 weeks. There's a horse sale in Casper that I'm routing through here on the return. The Pruitt pasture, and to see how the land situation has developed, a pause. And to see you. She looked at him for a moment. All right, she said. Come by when you get in. He put his hat on, stood, and went down the steps to his horse. She watched him ride out of the valley the way she had watched him ride out before, and the watching felt different than it had the first time. Not less complicated, but more settled. The way you feel about something you've stopped pretending not to feel. She went inside and wrote her letter to Holt. The response from the territorial office came not in 3 to 4 weeks, as Holt had estimated, but in 2.5, which told her something about the weight the Reyes survey documentation had carried. It arrived on a Wednesday with the supply wagon, addressed to Holt in Cottonwood, but Holt sent a rider to Elk Creek the same afternoon, with a summary that he'd written out in his compressed, careful hand. Evelyn read it at the kitchen table in her quarters with the door open to the warm June air, and she read it twice and then she sat back and looked at the ceiling. The territorial office had suspended Wick's claim pending a full investigation. The Reyes survey documentation had been accepted as counter-evidence of record. Wick was barred from pursuing the deed transfer or any contact with the Pruitt family regarding the eastern acreage until the investigation concluded. Furthermore, and this was the part she read 3 times, the office had identified 2 additional properties in the Northern Territories where similar claims had been filed by Wick's agency in the previous 18 months. Both were under review. Holt's note at the bottom said, "Your instinct about the school closures was correct. The Reed settlement lost 6 families following a disputed claim in 1885. The school there closed in December of that year. I have included this in the formal record. Well done, Miss Hart." She folded the letter and held it in both hands and thought about Rafael Reyes spending 3 days with his instruments on a cold morning 8 years ago, making measurements that were precise and true, keeping records that his wife preserved in a tin box wrapped in oilskin against a future she couldn't have predicted. She thought about Maria sending Samuel across the valley on a Saturday morning, trusting the teacher. She thought about Abner Pruitt sitting up all night with a shame that wasn't his. She went to find Margaret. Margaret Pruitt received the news with the stillness of someone who had been holding something heavy for a long time and was only now allowed to put it down. She read the summary twice, like Evelyn had, and then she set it on the table and pressed both hands flat on it, the way you press on something to confirm it's real. Abner's in the south pasture, she said. I'll take it to him. No. Margaret picked up the letter. I will. Evelyn letter. She walked back through the settlement slowly, past the creek and the Bower place, and she thought about what it meant that the thing had worked not cleanly, not without cost, but it had worked, and the land was still the Pruitts, and the investigation was opened and Wick was stopped. She thought about the families in the Northern Territories who were now under review because she had written a letter asking about school closures. She thought about the ones who'd already lost. She couldn't fix what had already happened. She could only do what she could do from where she was, with what she had. That had always been the truth. She was just clearer on it now than she'd been before. Caleb came back on a Friday as he'd said he would, 10 days after leaving and 4 days after the territorial office letter. He rode in at mid-afternoon with a look that said the Casper sale had gone well, and the road had been long, and he went to the Pruitts first, which was right, and came to the schoolhouse an hour later. Evelyn was sweeping the schoolroom. The school term had ended the previous week, and she was doing the end-of-term cleaning with the methodical satisfaction of someone who liked to put things in order before they sat still. She heard him on the porch and came to the door with the broom still in her hand. Pruitt told me, he said. Good. I didn't want to tell it twice. He leaned against the doorframe. He had the look of a man who had received news he'd been hoping for and hadn't let himself hope for too openly. The Northern Territory reviews. Holt confirmed it this morning by letter. 2 properties, both under formal review. She went back to sweeping. It won't undo what happened to the families that already sold, but it stops it from happening again. That matters. Yes, she said, it does. He came inside, which he hadn't been invited to do, but which she didn't object to. He sat on the edge of one of the student desks with the loose-limbed patience of someone who had no agenda beyond being in the same room. She kept sweeping. How's the Reyes boy? He asked. Samuels. She swept a corner. He finished mapping the entire valley from his bedroom window using the geometry I've been teaching him since April. He drew the map to scale. It's the most accurate thing I've seen produced in this schoolroom. Caleb was quiet. He doesn't think of himself as someone who belongs in school, she said, but he thinks of himself as someone who understands the land. And for now, those 2 things are pointing in the same direction, so I'm using that. And Hannah? First correspondence materials are done. She's already into the 2nd set. She leaned the broom against the wall. She's going to need to leave Elk Creek in 2 or 3 years. She needs more than I can give her, and more than the county can provide remotely. I've been writing to a women's secondary institution in Denver about a scholarship program. He looked at her. Does Hannah know? Not yet. I wanted to know whether it was possible before I put the idea in her head. She sat on the edge of her own desk across from him. If it's possible, I'll talk to Heinrich and then to Hannah, in that order. And if Heinrich says no, then I'll make the case. Slowly and with evidence, the way I do everything. She looked at her hands. He loves her. He wants what's best for her. Those 2 things will win out over worry if I give them enough time. Caleb looked at her sitting on her desk in the empty schoolroom, in the summer afternoon light that came through this west window and turned the dust motes into something resembling intention. You've built something here, he said. In 4 months. We've built something, she said. The families, the children, Margaret Abner, me. She looked at him. You in the ways you've been present. I'm not a consistent presence, he said. I'm in and out. I know that. She looked at him steadily. I'm not asking for consistent. I'm not asking for anything, Caleb. I'm saying what's true. She paused. You've been part of this. He was quiet for a long moment. He had his hands on his knees and his hat on the desk beside him and the afternoon light on his face. And he looked like a man arriving at something he'd been circling for months and was finally close enough to touch. I want to ask you something, he said. She waited. I want to ask you if I can come back. Not as someone passing by on a horse route. He looked at her directly, regularly, with a reason. What reason? You, he said. That reason. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what she'd told herself in February, about not organizing herself around a man's intentions until those intentions were made explicit. Here were the intentions, here was the explicitness. She had waited for the evidence, and the evidence was sitting on a student desk 12 feet away from her with its hat beside and its hands on its knees. You'd need to mean it, she said. I don't want something that works until it doesn't. I know that. And you'd need to understand that this, she indicated the room, the settlement outside the window, the whole shape of the life she'd built. This isn't something I'd leave for someone. I'm not that woman anymore. If I ever was, I know that too, he said. I'm not asking you to leave anything. I'm asking to be part of what's already here. She looked at the room. She looked at the blackboard they'd hung together in April, with the date still on it she'd left it there. She realized she'd written around it for 2 months without erasing it. April 28, 1887, in her careful schoolteacher's hand, the first thing on the new board. Yes, she said, you can come back with a reason. He exhaled. It was not dramatic. It was the exhale of a man who had been holding something carefully and was now allowed to set it down. He picked up his hat and looked at it for a moment, and she could see in his face the unguarded version that appeared when he stopped managing himself. I should go, he said. Let you finish. In a minute, she stood up from the desk. There's something I want to say before you do. He waited. She crossed her arms, not defensively, but the way she did when she was thinking something through as she said it. I came here in February thinking the worst thing that had happened to me was being left on a train platform. I thought I was starting over, rebuilding from a ruin. She stopped. But I've been thinking about it differently lately. I don't think I was rebuilding. I think I was starting. The thing I left behind wasn't a ruin, it was just something that didn't fit. The school in Philadelphia, the arrangements, the careful management of what I said and when I said it. She looked at him. None of that was me. It was the shape someone else had made for me, and I'd gotten so accustomed to it that I didn't know it didn't fit until I was standing in the cold without it. He was watching her quietly. The point is, she said, I didn't find this life by accident. I didn't land here because I had no other options. I chose it. Every morning when I get up and light the stove and wait for 24 children to come through that door, I'm choosing it. She paused. I want you to know that. Because I want whatever is between us to start from the true version of who I am, not some softened account of it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the true version is what made me want to come back in the first place. She looked at him. I know, she said. That's why I'm saying it plainly instead of letting you find it out slowly. He stood up from the desk and put his hat on, and she walked with him to the door, and they stood on the porch in the June afternoon, with the valley spread below them, and the creek making its sound and the Bower children visible in the distance, doing something with a fence post that was probably helpful. Before you go, she said. He turned. She looked at him, and something she had been managing carefully for months stopped being managed. She stepped forward, and she kissed him, not the other way around, not waiting to be asked, because she was done waiting for permission to do things she had already decided to do. It was not a long kiss. It was not a tentative one. It was the kiss of a woman who knew her own mind, offered to a man she had been watching and understanding for 4 months, and it lasted as long as it needed to and no longer. She stepped back. He looked at her with the unguarded face, the real one, the one that changed everything about how he appeared. All right, he said, which was not the most articulate response, but it was the honest one. All right, she agreed. He walked down the porch steps and untied his horse and mounted, and she stood on the porch and watched him ride toward the Pruitt place, and then she went back inside and picked up the broom and finished sweeping the schoolroom. Summer settled over Elk Creek with the particular generosity of a Wyoming July that decided to cooperate long days, warm evenings, the creek running clear and cold, the families working their land with the methodical intensity of people for whom summer was not leisure, but the concentrated effort that made everything else possible. Evelyn used the break between terms to do what she'd been making notes about all spring. She reorganized the supply system the community had been bringing things to the school in the ad hoc, well-meaning way of people who wanted to help but had no coordinating mechanism, which meant 3 families brought chalk in March and no one brought ink until May. She put together a simple list, distributed it at a community meeting she organized in the Pruitt barn, and within 2 weeks, the supply situation was running on a rotating schedule that required almost no management. She finished the letter to the Denver institution about Hannah's scholarship and sent it with a full record of Hannah's work. The letter back came in early July and said the institution was interested and would send an assessor to Elk Creek in the fall. She told Heinrich Bauer on a Tuesday morning after school, sitting at his kitchen table with Maria Reyes's tamales as a peace offering, because she'd learned that in this community food communicated what words sometimes struggled with. Heinrich listened to the whole thing without speaking, his large hands flat on the table, his face doing the complicated work of a father, absorbing information about a future that was simultaneously wonderful and terrifying. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. She's 11, he said. I know, the assessment is in the fall. Nothing would happen for 2 years at the earliest, possibly 3. She looked at him steadily. I'm not trying to take her anywhere. I'm trying to make sure that when she's ready to go, the door is open. He looked at his hands. Her mother and I came from Indiana so she could have something better than what we had. I know, but better as you imagine it a certain way. You don't imagine it meaning she goes to Denver. His voice was not angry. It was the voice of a man renegotiating his idea of what he'd been working toward. "She's my oldest. She's brilliant," Evelyn said. "And she's kind, which is rarer than brilliant. She could do almost anything she decides to do." She paused. "But only if the doors are open. And I can only hold this door open for so long." Heinrich looked at her. He had the same quality his daughter had: direct, evaluating, not easily moved but not closed. "You believe in her," he said. "Completely," Evelyn said. He was quiet for another long moment. "I'll talk to her mother." "Good," Evelyn said. "And Heinrich, Hannah doesn't need to know about the assessment yet. Let's see what the institution says before we put the idea in her head." He almost smiled. "You think like a father." "I think like someone who grew up watching a man love his work," she said, "and watching what it cost him when it was taken before he was ready." July became August, and August had its own rhythms. Caleb came through 4 times, which was more than his business required, and which nobody in the settlement commented on directly, because they were frontier people who understood that some things were true, whether or not you said them aloud. He and Evelyn had arrived at a pattern that suited them both. He came to the schoolhouse when he came through. They ate together, or walked or talked about what was happening in the county, or the territory, or the particular problems of 24 children, and a horse operation that ran between 3 towns. He helped when there was something to help with, and stayed out of the way when there wasn't. He did not try to rearrange anything about her life, and she did not try to rearrange anything about his. It was not a simple arrangement. It had the ordinary friction of 2 people who thought for themselves and occasionally disagreed, which they did twice in July, over things she couldn't now quite reconstruct, and which had resolved themselves in the way most honest disagreements resolved, not by one person backing down, but by both people looking at the thing from a slightly different angle and finding they were closer than the argument had suggested. The Wick investigation concluded in August. Holt sent the official letter directly to Abner, with a copy to Evelyn as the teacher of record, who had contributed to the documentation. Wick's agency had been found to have filed fraudulent claims against 3 properties in the county, including Pruitt's eastern acreage. His license to operate as a land agent in the territory had been suspended pending a criminal review. The 2 Northern Territory cases were being handled separately, but were expected to reach similar conclusions. The Pruitt land was confirmed, without qualification, as belonging to Abner Pruitt and his heirs. Evelyn was in the schoolroom when the copy arrived, reorganizing the book supply for the fall term. She read it, folded it, and put it in the drawer of her desk. Then she walked to the Pruitt place. Abner was on the porch. He stood up when he saw her coming, and she could see in his face that Holt's letter had already arrived, that he'd already read it, that Margaret was probably inside doing something vigorous with the kitchen, because that was how Margaret processed things that moved her. "Miss Hart," he said. She stopped at the porch steps. "It's done," she said. He nodded. He looked out over his land, the eastern section, the pasture where the creek ran along the border, the fence that had been his father-in-law's first, and was now his, and would someday be someone else's, and his face did something that she had not seen it do in the 5 months she'd known him. He let himself feel it, not dramatically, not with any performance. His jaw tightened, and his eyes went distant, and he stood very straight. And then after a moment, he let out a slow breath, and the tightness left his face, and he looked like a man who had carried something heavy for long enough that the absence of it had its own weight. "Thank you," he said, "for what you did. For all of it." Maria Reyes's survey did most of the work, Evelyn said. Raphael's instruments and his precision and her care in keeping what he left her. All I did was take it to the right person. "That's not nothing," Abner said. "No," she agreed, "it's not nothing." She walked back to the schoolhouse in the August afternoon, past the creek and the Bower place, and she thought about Raphael Reyes, who had never lived to see his measurements matter in the way they mattered today. And she thought about the families in the north who might get their land back, because a woman in a Wyoming schoolroom had asked Holt to look at school closures. And she thought about the ones who were already gone, already scattered, their communities broken by a fraud they hadn't had the tools to fight. She thought about what it meant to have the tools, to know how to read a document and write a letter and understand the structure of an argument, to know who to go to and what to say when you got there. She thought about Clara Finch on the first afternoon, saying, "I want them to be able to take care of themselves. I want them to be able to read a contract and understand it." That was the answer. That had always been the answer. Not saving people after the fact, but equipping them before it. Not arriving as a rescue, but remaining as a resource. That was what school was. That was what she was doing in that one-room building with 12 desks and a stove and a blackboard they'd hung together on a cold April afternoon. She had understood it before. She understood it more deeply now. The night before the fall term started, Caleb came through Elk Creek on his way back from a sale in Casper. It was a Sunday evening in September, and the summer warmth was starting to thin at the edges, the mornings coming cooler, the evenings carrying the first suggestion of what was coming. Evelyn was on the porch with her lesson plans for the first week, going over them by lamplight. She'd brought the lamp outside, which she rarely did, because the evening was too pleasant to waste indoors. He rode in and tied his horse without hurrying, and came up the steps and sat in the other chair, the one that had started to seem like it was his in the way that objects acquire association, and looked at her lesson plans without touching them. Term starts tomorrow, he said. 8 o'clock, she set the plans aside. 26 students this year. The Hannigan family moved in from Laramie in July. 3 children, I heard. They bought the Anderson place. The oldest is 14. I'll have to figure out where he fits. She looked at the lamp. And Thomas Dunn came by last week to show me that he'd been practicing his reading all summer. He brought a book he'd gotten through on his own. Caleb was quiet. He carried it with both hands, she said, like it was breakable. The silence between them was the good kind, the kind that had something in it rather than nothing. The valley was making its September sounds. The wind in the grass a different note than it had been in summer. The creek lower now. The birds different. I've been thinking, Caleb said. She waited. I've been thinking about what it means to be in and out of a place. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, which was the position he took when he was saying something he'd worked up to. I've been running horses between towns my whole adult life because I didn't want to be tied to one piece of land. My father was tied to land and it wore him out, I remember, she said. But there's a difference between being tied to something and choosing it. He looked at his hands. I've been confusing those two things for a long time. She looked at the side of his face in the lamplight. She did not prompt him, because he was getting somewhere and she didn't want to interrupt the route. There's a ranch about 12 miles from here, he said. Good grazing, good water access. The family that had it moved back to Missouri last spring couldn't take the winters. It's been sitting empty. He paused. I put an inquiry in with Holt last month. She was very still. I haven't bought it, he said quickly. I made an inquiry. I wanted to know if it was still available and what the price was. He looked at her. I'm not telling you this I'm not assuming anything about what it means for you. I'm telling you because I said I wouldn't let false things sit in the space, and not telling you would be a kind of false thing. She looked at him for a long moment. The lamplight was steady. The valley was quiet. 12 miles was close enough to matter and far enough to be its own thing. Is the price reasonable, she said. He blinked. Then it's workable. And the grazing? Better than what I'm using now. There's a creek on the eastern side. Would you keep the Laramie runs? Some of them. I'd restructure the operation. Base it from the ranch rather than from town. He watched her face. It's not a quick decision. I've been thinking about it since June. Since June, she said, since the evening we sat on these steps with tamales. She looked at the empty chair beside him, the one she was sitting in. She thought about February and the train platform and the letter and the $68. She thought about every choice she'd made since then. Every morning she'd lit the stove and waited for the children to come through the door. Every evening she'd sat at this table and worked and slept and woken up glad to be where she was. She thought about what she'd told him in the schoolroom in June. I'm not that woman anymore. I won't leave this for someone. And she thought about what he'd said back. I'm not asking you to leave anything. I'm asking to be part of what's already here. Make the inquiry a purchase, she said. He looked at her. If it's workable and the grazing is good and you've been thinking about it since June, she said, then make it a purchase and see what it is to be, somewhere on purpose. He was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that was doing real work. I've never bought land before, he said. I've never taught on the frontier before, she said. We're both figuring it out. He looked at her, and she looked back, and the lamp between them was steady, and the valley was all around them, and it was September in Wyoming, and the world was the size it actually was rather than the size fear or loneliness made it seem. He reached over, without announcement, and took her hand. He held it the way you hold something you mean to keep not tight, just certain. She let him. They sat on the porch until the lamp burned low, talking about the ranch and the fall term and Samuel's mapsots and Hannah's second correspondence set, and the Hannigan boy who was 14 and didn't yet know where he fit. They talked about Nora, who was coming to visit at the end of the month, and who had written to Evelyn, directly with the comfortable presumption of a woman who had decided they were friends and saw no reason to be coy about it. They talked about the winter coming and what it would mean for the road between here and 12 miles away, and whether it was passable in February. It was passable, Caleb said. He knew the road. She believed him. There are things you cannot know in advance about a life. You cannot know which arrivals will become departures and which departures will circle back. You cannot know which failures are the last chapter and which are just the hinge between one thing and the next. Evelyn Hart had stood on a train platform in February with a ruined plan and $68 and learned slowly and not without cost that the story she thought was ending had been beginning the entire time. That is perhaps the most important thing a person can know, and it is the thing that is hardest to believe, from the inside of the worst moment, that what looks like the end of the road is sometimes just a turn in it. She was not the same woman who had stepped off the train in Cottonwood. She was harder in some ways and more open in others, and she had done things she hadn't known she could do. Organized a community, fought a land fraud, learned the names of every bird in a Wyoming valley because a 13-year-old boy had known them, and she'd decided that was worth knowing. She had built something that would outlast the school term, that would outlast the year, that would matter to Hannah Bauer decades from now, when Hannah was doing something that nobody in Elk Creek could currently imagine. She had not needed rescuing. She had needed once a warm room and a cup of coffee, and someone who asked the right question instead of offering the easy answer. Nora Delaney had given her that. Everything after had been hers. The morning of the first day of the fall term, she was in the schoolroom by 6:30. She got the stove going, and she opened all the windows to let the September air move through, and she looked at the desks arranged the way she'd arranged them, and the blackboard with its new section that still had April 28, 1887 written in the corner in her hand, which she had decided to leave there as long as the chalk lasted. She thought about her father in the school on Archer Street, talking about his students at dinner like neighbors. She thought about what it meant to do work that was yours, not the work assigned to you, not the work that fit the shape someone else had made, but the work that fit the shape you actually were. She picked up the chalk and wrote the date at the top of the board. September 8, 1887. First day of fall term. At 8:10, the door opened, and Hannah Bauer came in first, as she always did, and looked at the room with the evaluating thoroughness that Evelyn had come to love like a signature. Behind her, Thomas Dunn came in with his older brother, and then the younger Bowers, and then Samuel Reyes, who was no longer pretending to be indifferent, and then the Finch boys, and then one by one the others, until the room was full of the specific noise of children settling into the start of something. At the back of the line, hesitating in the doorway as newcomers did, was a tall 14-year-old boy who didn't yet know where he fit. "You must be Patrick Hannigan," Evelyn said. The boy looked at her with the wariness of someone who had been new before and knew it was a temporary condition that still required endurance. "Yes, ma'am, come in," she said. "There's a desk with good light by the window. We'll figure out the rest from there." He came in. He sat down. He looked at the room around him with the careful attention of a boy who was paying attention to everything while pretending to pay attention to nothing. Evelyn picked up her notebook and looked at 26 faces in various states of readiness, ranging from Hannah's focused alertness to the youngest Bower's barely suppressed distraction, and she felt the specific, earned satisfaction of a woman who was exactly where she had chosen to be, doing exactly what she had chosen to do. Outside, the September morning was going about its business. Somewhere 12 miles away, a man was making a decision about a ranch with good grazing and a creek on the eastern side. The valley was the same valley it had always been, full of the same families working the same hard land, but something in the texture of it had changed in the months she'd been here, or maybe it hadn't changed at all, and she was just finally able to see it clearly. "All right," Evelyn Hart said, to 26 children in a Wyoming schoolhouse on the first morning of fall, and picked up the chalk and began.